Artificial silk eternity. Morning in the blue neon begins without announcement. Alana's finger moves across the plastic leaf on the counter, gathering a thin line of dust and grease. The rose stands in its cheap vase, color faded into something between red and rust. It does not bend toward the light. It does not ask for water. Outside the window, the highway stretches flat and indifferent, carrying distance rather than destination. The air inside smells of frying fat and diluted detergent, a permanence that clings to skin. She pours the first coffee before the sun fully rises, black, bitter, unsoftened. Steam lifts and disappears into the low ceiling. The radio murmurs about a coming storm, its voice steady, almost hopeful. The sky remains clear. Elena listens without listening. Promises made through static have never required fulfillment. The bell above the door trembles once. Miller steps in, bringing cold air and the scent of old engine oil. He takes his corner seat as if it were assigned long ago. She sets the cup before him. They exchange no greetings. He studies the road through the glass. She studies her hands. Silence settles between them with the weight of something agreed upon. A blade of sunlight cuts across the counter and strikes the rose. The petals catch it, reflecting a thin, artificial shine. For a moment, it appears almost alive. Then the light shifts. Elena lifts the vase to wipe beneath it. The flower is light in her hand, yet it leaves an imprint on the space it occupies. Real things decay. This one only fades. By noon, drivers pass through in a brief procession of faces and orders. Plates touch the counter with mechanical precision. Voices rise and fall without attachment. When the room empties again, Helena finds herself looking toward the door. No one stands there. The road continues to move away from itself. Inside, the rose waits unchanged, as if eternity were made from plastic and habit. The lunch hour leaves behind a residue of sound. Forks scrape plates, chairs drag across linoleum, coins strike the counter with brief authority. None of it alters the air. Elena moves between tables with measured steps, collecting cups still warm from unfamiliar hands. The drivers avoid her eyes. They carry the smell of gasoline in distance, and vanish back into it. Miller coughs into his fist. The sound is dry, mechanical, as if something inside him has rusted beyond repair. He folds his newspaper without reading it. Headlines speak of distant wars and collapsing markets. He has seen enough endings to know that none of them arrive here with urgency. The blue neon remains intact, which is another word for unchanged. In the kitchen, a faucet leaks in patient intervals. Each drop strikes metal with a muted tap, counting time more faithfully than any clock. Elena pauses beside the sink, listening. The rhythm reminds her of boots on gravel years ago. No faces, only the memory of departure. She dries her hands and returns to the counter without allowing the thought to settle. The door opens again. A man in a gray jacket steps inside, bringing with him the scent of fuel and open sky. His gaze lingers too long on Elena, as if searching for an answer she has already declined to give. He orders a hamburger. She writes it down without lifting her eyes. Some exchanges are completed before words are spoken. While he waits, the stranger studies the plastic rose. "Strange flower," he says, almost lightly. Elena wipes the counter in slow arcs, leaving no trace of acknowledgement. Outside, Miller lights a cigarette, smoke dissolving in the wind. When the man finishes eating, he leaves without farewell. The engine fades into distance. The rose remains where it stands, holding its colorless eternity against the gathering blue of evening. Evening lowers itself over the blue neon without spectacle. The sky turns a dense blue that carries no promise of rain. Inside, the fluorescent lights hum with a tired persistence. Elena counts the bills from the register, smoothing each note as if it might change its value under her palm. Numbers align, obedient and meaningless. Across the room, Miller finishes his coffee and studies the darkening road as though it might finally confess something. Cloud shadows drift over the asphalt outside, large and unhurried. They resemble animals that have forgotten why they move. The radio continues its low report of distant conflicts, names of towns Elena will never see. She adjusts the dial slightly, not to change the station, but to soften the intrusion. Her own war ended long ago in a silence that required no treaty. The stranger in the gray jacket is already part of the day's sentiment. Only a crumpled napkin remains on the table where he sat. Elena collects it, flattening the paper before discarding it. For a moment, she feels the outline of his presence. Then it dissolves like exhaust in open air. Miller rises slowly, placing coins beside his cup. "Until tomorrow," he says. It is not optimism. It is maintenance. In the kitchen, the leaking faucet persists. Drop after drop marks the passing of hours no one has claimed. Elena turns it tighter, but the rhythm continues, softer now. She lifts the plastic rose and wipes the counter beneath it. The petals are cool and unyielding. Under the dim light, the color deepens toward something almost black. One by one, she switches off the lights. Shadows stretch across the walls and settle. The last lamp above the counter casts a narrow circle around the vase. Elena moves it a fraction to the left, precise, deliberate. Outside, the highway lies empty, extending into darkness without complaint. She locks the door. In the final quiet, the rose and the room share the same stillness, and it is nearly indistinguishable from peace. Night does not arrive. It accumulates. The blue neon stands within it like a forgotten object, its sign flickering in uneven pulses. Elena remains behind the counter a moment longer than necessary, listening to the refrigerator's low vibration. The room without voices feels larger, almost exposed. She presses her palm flat against the surface where cups have rested all day. The warmth has already gone. She steps outside to smoke. The air is colder than the radio predicted. No storm gathers on the horizon, only a stretched band of stars above the highway. Miller's earlier footprints have blurred in the dust. Engines pass in the distance without slowing. The town does not resist their leaving. Elena inhales and holds the smoke as if it were proof of something entering her body by choice. Back inside, she checks the latch twice. Metal answers metal with a short, definite click. The mirror behind the counter catches her reflection in fragments: shoulder, cheek, the pale line of her jaw. She does not look for recognition. What stands there is a function shaped like a woman, trained to pour, to wipe, to endure fluorescent light. In the kitchen, the faucet finally falls silent after one more reluctant drop. The quiet that follows is dense, almost material. Elena dries her hands and walks back to the counter. The plastic rose waits where she placed it. In darkness, its artificial petals no longer declare themselves. They resemble something once alive, stripped of fragrance and consequence. She turns off the final lamp. The sign outside hums faintly, then steadies. Within the unlit room, objects lose their edges and share a common outline. The highway remains empty, extending past sight. Elena stands for a breath longer, then moves toward the back door. The rose stays upright in its vase, untouched by time, patient as habit. Before dawn, the air inside the blue neon feels heavier than the night. Elena unlocks the door while the sky is still colorless. The metal handle leaves a chill in her palm. She does not switch on the main lights immediately. For a few seconds, she stands in the dimness, letting the shapes of tables and stools emerge on their own, as if the room were deciding whether to continue. She moves to the counter and straightens the plastic rose. It has shifted a fraction during the night, though no one has touched it. The petals hold yesterday's dust in their folds. She wipes them carefully, not to restore beauty, only to maintain order. The vase leaves a faint ring on the surface beneath it. The mark will remain longer than any conversation. Coffee begins to drip into the pot with a muted insistence. The smell spreads slowly, filling the corners first. Outside, a single truck passes without stopping. Its headlights brush the window and disappear. Elena watches the reflection fade from the glass. Motion exists, but it does not concern her. Miller arrives earlier than usual. His coat is buttoned wrong, and he does not correct it. He sits without removing it, hands folded around the cup she sets before him. Neither of them remarks on the hour. He studies the rose as though it were a mechanical part he cannot identify. She notices his gaze, but says nothing. When the sun finally rises, it brings a thin, indifferent light. It touches the counter, the cups, the faded petals. Nothing responds. The day resumes its position, aligned with the one before it. Elena rests her fingertips briefly on the edge of the vase, ensuring it stands exactly where it should. Outside, the highway continues to withdraw into itself, carrying no message back. By mid-morning, the light turns thin and metallic, spreading across the counter in a pale sheet. The blue neon absorbs it without warmth. Elena refills sugar dispensers that no one empties and aligns the salt shakers with a precision that borders on ritual. The plastic rose stands between them, its stem slightly bent, as if imitating fatigue. A pair of drivers enters, boots heavy with road dust. They speak loudly about miles and deadlines, about cargo that must arrive somewhere else. Elena writes down their orders without raising her head. Their laughter strikes the walls and falls flat. When they leave, they take their urgency with them, leaving only crumbs and a faint trace of cologne. Miller remains in his corner, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger. He no longer looks at the highway. Instead, he studies the counter as though it contains a diagram only he can read. His cough surfaces again, brief and contained. Elena brings him water without comment. He nods once, in acknowledgement of maintenance rather than gratitude. At noon, clouds gather but refuse to darken. The radio repeats its forecast of rain. The prediction hangs in the air like a postponed apology. Elena wipes the window from the inside, though it is not dirty enough to justify the effort. Through the glass, the road appears suspended, a strip of asphalt holding its breath. She lifts the rose to clear a small stain beneath it. The petals catch the overhead light and reflect it back without depth. For a moment, she imagines placing it outside, letting the wind test its permanence. Instead, she returns it to the exact center of the counter. Stability here is measured in centimeters. When the afternoon thins toward evening, the room grows quieter again. Miller stands, leaving a few coins beside his empty cup. He does not say goodbye. The door closes softly behind him. Elena watches the space he occupied settle into neutrality. The rose remains upright, unchanged, as if the day has passed through it without leaving a mark. The afternoon settles into a narrow band of light across the floor. Elena stands behind the counter and feels the hours compress rather than pass. The air smells of reheated oil and something faintly metallic from the kitchen sink. She adjusts the blinds a few degrees, enough to redirect the glare from the register screen. The plastic rose absorbs the shift without reaction, its petals dulled to a tired crimson. A delivery truck stops briefly outside, engine idling like an impatient animal. The driver steps in only to ask for directions he will not follow. Elena points west without stepping from her place. He thanks her with a distracted nod and disappears. The engine revs, then thins in distance. The road resumes its blank expression. Inside, the faucet begins its measured dripping again. Each drop lands with a small, stubborn sound. Elena counts 3 of them before tightening the valve. The silence that follows feels incomplete, as if the room preferred the rhythm. She dries her hands on a towel that carries the scent of bleach and long use. Toward evening, the sky darkens without drama. Clouds gather but refuse to break. The radio's forecast repeats itself in a patient loop. Elena leans her weight against the counter and studies the rose. A thin crack runs along one petal, nearly invisible unless the light strikes it directly. She touches it once, confirming the damage. When the last customer of the day leaves, a man who pays exact change and avoids her gaze, the door closes with a restrained click. Elena begins stacking chairs onto tables, each movement economical. She leaves the counter light on. In its narrow circle, the rose stands almost black, its fracture hidden again. Outside, the highway stretches into shadow, carrying nothing back. Rain arrives without thunder, a thin vertical line against the windows. The forecast finally becomes fact, but without drama. Elena watches the drops gather and slide, tracing uncertain paths down the glass. The highway blurs into a gray ribbon. For a moment, distance loses its outline. Inside, the smell of wet asphalt seeps through the doorframe. She places a bucket beneath a small leak near the entrance. Water strikes metal with a hollow note, different from the faucet's earlier rhythm. The plastic rose stands untouched by the dampness, its petals immune to swelling or decay. It does not register the weather. No customers come while the rain holds. Chairs remain grounded to the floor. The radio lowers itself into static between songs, then returns to news of flooded roads somewhere else. Elena wipes the counter twice, though it is already clean. Her reflection moves faintly in the window, layered over the blurred landscape. When the rain thins, a single car slows but does not turn in. Headlights pause, then continue forward. Elena feels the brief interruption as a physical shift, like a breath almost taken. She adjusts the rose by a fraction, aligning it with the edge of the register. The movement restores proportion. Dusk gathers quickly after the storm. The air cools, carrying the smell of washed dust. Elena switches on the sign outside. Its blue glow trembles once, then steadies. In the muted light, the rose appears darker, almost natural in silhouette. Beyond the glass, the road reflects the last of the sky and empties itself again. Morning after rain carries a sharper light. The asphalt outside holds a faint sheen, reflecting the sky in broken strips. Elena unlocks the door and steps into the cooled air of the blue neon. The room smells cleaner than usual, as if the storm had rinsed even what it could not reach. She turns on the lights one by one. The hum returns, familiar and restrained. She checks the bucket near the entrance. A thin measure of water rests at the bottom, proof that something fell during the night. She empties it in the sink and dries the rim carefully. The faucet remains quiet for now. On the counter, the plastic rose appears almost brighter against the washed morning, its faded red sharpened by contrast. She rotates the vase slightly, testing how the light strikes the cracked petal. Miller does not arrive at his usual hour. The absence settles slowly, like dust. Elena pours coffee anyway and lets it stand warming on the plate. A pickup passes outside without slowing. The highway looks renewed, but no less indifferent. She studies the door longer than necessary, then returns to the register. Near noon, a different man enters, young, restless, scanning the room as if measuring it against other stops. He orders quickly and eats faster. His phone vibrates against the table. He answers with impatience, speaking of schedules and missed connections. Elena refills his water glass once. He leaves before the plate cools. The day stretches without complication. Elena counts receipts and aligns them in a neat stack. She touches the rose again, pressing the cracked petal into place, though it does not hold. Outside, the reflected sky fades from the road surface as it dries. By evening, the sheen is gone. The highway resumes its dull certainty, and inside, nothing asks to be altered. The 10th day since the rain begins without announcement. The sky is pale and undecided. Elena opens the blue neon and pauses just inside, measuring the quiet before it settles around her shoulders. The air has returned to its usual density: fat, detergent, metal. Whatever the storm touched has already withdrawn. She brews coffee and leaves the pot to darken. The plastic rose stands precisely where she aligned it last night. The cracked petal has shifted outward again, a small defiance of symmetry. She presses it back with her thumb. It resists nothing, yet never remains corrected. Outside, a freight truck passes. Its weight felt more than heard. Miller arrives later than usual. His steps are slower, the pause at the threshold longer. He removes his coat this time and folds it over the chair with care. Elena sets the cup before him. He nods once and studies the rose instead of the road. Still standing, he says quietly. It is unclear whether he speaks of the flower or himself. Midday brings two travelers arguing in low, exhausted voices. Their dispute concerns directions, but beneath it lies something older. Elena writes down their order and keeps her eyes level. Plates arrive, are emptied, are cleared. The argument fades into the scrape of chairs. When they leave, the room inhales and holds. In the afternoon, the faucet resumes its intermittent tapping. Elena tightens it again, harder this time. Silence returns, but thinner. Miller finishes his coffee and stands, steadying himself with a hand on the table. Tomorrow, he says. The word carries less certainty than before. She watches him cross the parking lot and merge with the pale horizon. As evening lowers, she switches off the lights one by one. The final lamp casts a narrow circle around the counter. The rose absorbs the glow, its surface dull, unresponsive. Elena moves it a millimeter to the right, correcting a deviation no one else would notice. Beyond the glass, the highway extends without promise. Inside, the room holds its shape. The 11th morning begins with wind. It presses dust against the windows in thin, restless sheets. Elena unlocks the door and feels the draft slip past her ankles. The blue neon inhales the outside air without gratitude. She secures the door behind her and turns on the counter light first, leaving the rest of the room in half shadow. The plastic rose has collected a new film of grit overnight. Fine particles settle into the crack along the petal's edge. She wipes it carefully with a damp cloth, watching the color reappear beneath her touch. The red is neither bright nor honest. It is a persistence without growth. She replaces the vase in its exact position, measuring the distance from the register with her eye. Coffee brews. The radio struggles through static before finding a station. News of markets, of roads closed somewhere west. The wind rattles the sign outside, a dull vibration that repeats without rhythm. No one enters during the first hour. Elena rearranges the sugar packets by color, though they will be disturbed again. Near midday, Miller does not come. The corner chair remains empty, angled slightly toward the window as he left it yesterday. Elena considers straightening it, but leaves it untouched. The absence feels deliberate, as if the chair were holding a place in trust. A single customer stops for takeout and leaves without sitting. By late afternoon, the wind thins but does not stop. Elena steps outside briefly, squinting into the open lot. The highway carries dust instead of traffic. She returns inside and checks the faucet. It is dry for now. She rests her fingers on the rose's stem, steadying it against a tremor she cannot attribute to the wind. When dusk arrives, it does so abruptly. The sky turns the color of cooled steel. Elena switches off the main lights and leaves the counter lamp glowing. The rose stands within its circle, neither fragile nor alive. She locks the door and listens to the metal settle. In the quiet that follows, the empty chair in the corner remains angled toward the road. The 12th day carries a colder edge. Elena opens the blue neon and notices the corner chair first. It has not shifted. Dust has gathered along its legs, thin and patient. She leaves it as it stands, angled toward the window, as if someone might return to complete an unfinished gesture. The air inside feels tighter. She switches on the lights and moves directly to the counter. The plastic rose leans slightly, disturbed perhaps by yesterday's wind. She straightens the stem and studies the crack along the petal. It has widened by a fraction. The change is minor but irreversible. She presses it once, then releases it. The pedal holds its flaw. Coffee drips into the pot with a steady rhythm. She pours 2 cups out of habit and lets one sit untouched near the register. Steam rises and thins. Outside, the highway carries a slow procession of trucks that do not turn in. Their engines pass like distant weather. The radio mentions clear skies ahead. By noon, a salesman in a pressed shirt occupies a table near the door. He speaks loudly into his phone about expansion and opportunity. Elena brings his sandwich and nods at intervals that require no agreement. He glances at the rose and smiles faintly, as if amused by its stubborn presence. When he leaves, he takes nothing but his briefcase. The afternoon grows still. The faucet remains silent. The sign outside hums without flicker. Elena carries the untouched cup from the counter to the sink and empties it. The liquid darkens the drain for a moment before vanishing. She wipes the rim dry and returns to her place. As evening approaches, she aligns the receipts into a careful stack and counts the drawer. The numbers settle into order without significance. She adjusts the rose one last time, centering it between the salt and sugar. In the dim light, the cracked pedal casts a thin shadow across the counter. Outside, the highway recedes into blue distance. Inside, the empty chair remains turned toward the glass, waiting without expectation. The 13th morning arrives with frost along the edge of the parking lot. Elena notices it through the window before she unlocks the door. The cold sharpens the outline of everything: the sign, the counter, the empty chair in the corner. Inside, the air feels brittle. She turns on the heat and listens to the vents struggle into motion. The plastic rose has stiffened in the chill, its surface dulled to a deeper shade. A thin line of condensation marks the vase. Elena wipes it away and steadies the stem. The cracked petal now holds a faint white seam where the plastic has thinned. She studies it briefly, then adjusts the vase so the flaw faces the wall. Coffee begins its slow descent into the pot. The first customer is not Miller, but a woman with a child wrapped in a heavy jacket. They sit near the window. The child presses a palm against the glass, leaving a small temporary print. Elena brings hot chocolate without being asked for extra sugar. The woman thanks her quietly, as if careful not to disturb the room. When they leave, the chair across from the window remains slightly misaligned. Elena corrects it. She wipes the child's handprint from the glass with deliberate strokes. Outside, the frost begins to fade under a reluctant sun. The highway gleams briefly, then dulls again. Midday passes without the familiar cough from the corner. Elena pours a single cup and drinks it herself, standing behind the counter. The bitterness rests on her tongue longer than usual. The radio mentions colder nights ahead. She turns the volume down. By evening, the sky settles into a hard blue that resists warmth. Elena switches off the lights, except for the lamp above the counter. The rose stands in its narrow glow, its hidden crack turned inward. She moves it a fraction closer to the register, reducing the space around it. Outside, the frost has vanished completely, leaving no trace. Inside, the chair remains angled toward the road, patient and unclaimed. The 14th day begins under a sky the color of unpolished tin. Elena arrives before the sun lifts itself clear of the horizon. The blue neon waits in a thin gray light, its sign unlit, its windows opaque. She unlocks the door and steps inside. The cold has settled into the counter, into the metal legs of the stools. She rubs her hands together once and turns on the heat. The plastic rose stands where she left it, closer now to the register. The hidden crack remains turned inward, facing the wall. She hesitates, then rotates the vase so the flaw faces the room again. The pedal catches the morning light and reveals its pale seam without protest. Nothing here improves by concealment. Coffee drips into the pot. She pours one cup and leaves the second space empty. The corner chair still holds its angle toward the window. Dust has gathered along the seat in a fine layer. Elena brushes it off with her palm, not restoring the place, only preventing accumulation. Outside, a school bus passes without slowing, yellow against the muted land. Late morning brings a mechanic from the next town over. He smells of grease and speaks little. He eats in silence, studies the rose briefly, then studies Elena as if trying to place her within a memory. She refills his coffee without invitation. When he leaves, he nods once toward the empty corner before stepping back into the lot. The afternoon flattens. The radio reports clear roads and distant snow in the mountains. Elena aligns the sugar packets again, then stops midway, leaving one slightly out of line. The imbalance remains visible, a small concession to fatigue. At dusk, she switches on the sign outside. Its blue light steadies after a brief tremor. Inside, she dims the overhead fixtures and leaves the counter lamp glowing. The rose stands in full view, crack exposed, color drained by the artificial light. Elena rests her fingertips against the vase for a moment, then withdraws them. Beyond the glass, the highway extends into evening without interruption. The 15th morning arrives with a pale sun and a sharper wind. Elena unlocks the blue neon and feels the draft move across the floor toward the kitchen. She closes the door firmly and stands still for a moment, letting the room accept her presence. The counter holds the faint imprint of yesterday's light. The plastic rose remains upright, its crack visible, unapologetic. She does not adjust it today. Instead, she begins with the chairs, lowering each one from the tables with a measured rhythm. Wood meets linoleum in muted taps. The corner chair is set down last. She hesitates before placing it back at its angle toward the window, then does so without correction. Some arrangements no longer require intention. Coffee brews. The radio speaks of temperatures dropping overnight. Elena listens while wiping the counter in slow arcs. Outside, the highway carries a thin stream of vehicles that do not consider stopping. Their motion is steady, neither hurried nor delayed. She pours a single cup and leaves it near the register, untouched. Near midday, Miller's absence feels less like delay and more like conclusion. Elena notices that she no longer glances at the door as often. The empty chair holds its space without invitation. A delivery van pulls in briefly, the driver asking to use the restroom. He leaves quickly, carrying the smell of cold air back with him. In the afternoon, the faucet begins its intermittent tapping again. Elena tightens it, then stops halfway, allowing one final drop to fall. The sound lingers in the sink. She dries her hands and returns to the counter. The rose catches a thin beam of light and reflects it without warmth. As evening lowers, she counts the register and stacks the receipts with precise alignment. The sky darkens into a deepening blue. Elena turns off the lights one by one, leaving only the lamp above the counter. The rose stands within its circle, unchanged, the crack no longer hidden. She locks the door and listens to the wind move across the lot. Inside, the room holds its shape, patient and complete in its stillness. The 16th morning comes with a low ceiling of clouds that press close to the land. Elena opens the blue neon and senses the weight before she turns on the lights. The air feels sealed, as if the building has been holding its breath. She moves behind the counter and rests her palm briefly on the surface, grounding herself in its cool solidity. The plastic rose stands unchanged, its cracked petal now slightly warped at the edge. She studies it without touching. The flaw has begun to curl outward on its own, revealing a thin pale line where the material has thinned. There is no repair for such a thing, only repositioning. She leaves it as it is. Coffee drips steadily. The sound fills the room more than usual. No one enters during the first hour. Outside, the highway appears muted, vehicles passing with headlights on despite the morning. The sign above the door flickers once in the dim light, then steadies. Elena adjusts the volume on the radio until it becomes a background murmur. Near noon, a state trooper steps inside, boots carrying damp gravel. He orders black coffee and stands rather than sits. His gaze moves across the counter, pausing on the rows, then on the empty corner chair. He asks no questions. Elena refills his cup once. He leaves exact change and a folded receipt on the counter. The afternoon remains thin. The faucet stays silent. The wind does not rise. Elena reorganizes the receipts from the past week, aligning edges with mechanical care. She notices her hands have grown steadier in recent days. The absence of interruption has simplified movement. As dusk settles early under the cloud cover, she switches on the sign outside. Its blue glow leaks through the window, softening the edges of the room. She turns off the overhead lights and leaves the counter lamp burning. The rose casts a faint shadow, shaped like something almost organic. Elena locks the door and stands for a moment facing the highway. It continues without pause. Inside, the room remains intact, carrying the day's weight without complaint. The 17th morning begins in silence thick enough to feel deliberate. Elena unlocks the blue neon and notices the absence of wind. The air inside is still, holding yesterday's scent without dilution. She turns on the counter lamp first. Its narrow light isolates the rose before the rest of the room emerges. The cracked petal has been farther outward overnight. It no longer pretends to symmetry. Elena touches it with one finger and feels the rigid edge press back. There is no softness left in it. She considers trimming the damaged part with the small scissors from the register drawer, then closes the drawer again. The flaw has become proportionate to the hole. Coffee brews. The radio fails to find a clear station and settles into low static. Outside, the highway moves under a washed sky. A single sedan slows as if uncertain, then continues past the entrance. Elena watches its reflection fade from the window. The corner chair remains angled toward the road, dust settling evenly across its surface. Near midday, a young couple enters, speaking quietly. They choose a table far from the counter. Their hands touch across the surface in brief, distracted gestures. Elena brings their order and steps back without waiting for acknowledgement. The room holds their presence without absorbing it. When they leave, they forget a napkin folded into a precise square. In the afternoon, the faucet resumes a slow drip. Elena does not tighten it immediately. The measured sound fills the space between the static and the hum of the refrigerator. She leans against the counter and studies the rose. The bent petal now casts a sharper shadow under the lamp, creating the illusion of depth. As evening descends, she switches on the sign outside. The blue light steadies without flicker. She turns off the overhead fixtures and leaves the counter lamp glowing. The rose stands uneven, crack exposed, petal bent outward like a small declaration. Elena locks the door and remains facing the darkened highway for a moment longer than usual. The road continues to recede, carrying nothing back. The 18th morning arrives with a faint mist that softens the parking lot into blurred shapes. Elena unlocks the blue neon and steps into the quiet as if entering water. The air feels suspended, neither warm nor cold. She turns on the counter lamp, allowing its circle of light to claim the rose before the rest of the room awakens. The bent petal has shifted again. It now leans away from the stem at a sharper angle, as though separating itself from the idea of a flower. Elena does not try to press it back. She wipes the vase instead, clearing a thin ring of residue from its base. The crack remains visible, a pale seam under the artificial red. Coffee begins its steady descent. Steam rises and dissolves into the muted air. Outside, the highway appears distant, vehicles moving as blurred outlines behind the mist. No one enters during the first hour. Elena aligns the receipts from yesterday and notices one missing corner, torn cleanly away. She places it beneath the stack so the imperfection will not show. Late morning brings a delivery of bread. The driver leaves the crate near the door and departs without stepping fully inside. The mist begins to lift, revealing the edges of the lot. Elena carries the bread to the kitchen and returns to the counter. The faucet is silent. The radio speaks softly of clear skies ahead. By afternoon, the room regains its usual clarity. A lone traveler stops for coffee and sits at the counter rather than a table. He studies the rows for a moment, then studies Elena, as if weighing a question he decides not to ask. He finishes quickly and leaves a bill folded twice. As dusk settles, the mist has vanished completely. The highway stretches clean and exposed under a thinning sky. Elena switches on the sign outside and dims the interior lights. The rose stands uneven within the lamp's glow, its bent petal casting a longer shadow than before. She locks the door and rests her hand briefly on the counter. Inside, the room holds its shape. Outside, the road continues, unaltered. The 19th morning opens under a hard, colorless sky. Elena unlocks the blue neon and notices how the light falls directly on the counter now, without softness. The mist is gone. Edges are defined again. She turns on the overhead lights out of habit, though they add little. The rose appears smaller in the sharper glare. The bent petal has thinned near its base, a pale stress line spreading outward. Elena studies it without expression. She considers removing the flower entirely, leaving only the empty vase. Instead, she rotates it a fraction, so the damaged side faces neither wall nor door, but the open room. Coffee brews. The sound is steady, familiar. The corner chair remains angled, dust less visible under the brighter morning. No one comes during the first hour. Elena wipes the window from the inside, though it does not require it. The highway moves in clear lines now, trucks distinct, shadows defined. Near midday, an older woman enters, carrying a small suitcase. She sits near the door and orders tea. Her hands tremble slightly as she lifts the cup. Elena notices, but does not comment. The woman glances at the rose, and then at the empty corner, as if searching for someone she expects to see. When she leaves, she carries her suitcase carefully, like a fragile promise. The afternoon stretches thin. The faucet resumes its drip, slower than before. Elena tightens it until the sound stops entirely. The silence feels heavier in its absence. She rests both hands on the counter and looks at the rose directly, not adjusting it this time. At dusk, she switches on the sign outside. Its blue light outlines the bent petal sharply against the counter. She turns off the interior lights one by one. The rose stands exposed within the narrowing circle of illumination, no longer symmetrical, no longer concealed. Elena locks the door and watches the last vehicle of the day pass without slowing. The highway remains exact and distant, carrying its motion away from her. The 20th morning comes without wind, without mist, without variation. Elena unlocks the blue neon and feels the sameness settle around her like a familiar coat. The air holds the scent of oil and detergent, unchanged. She switches on the counter lamp first. The rose stands within its narrow circle, bent petal casting a precise shadow. She does not rotate it today. The crack has widened slightly at the base, a thin split that suggests eventual separation. Elena runs her fingertip along the stem instead, confirming its balance. The vase leaves a faint ring on the counter, a permanent outline of position. She does not wipe it away. Coffee drips into the pot. She pours one cup and sets it near the register, leaving the second space empty as she has done for days. The corner chair remains angled toward the window. Dust has settled evenly across the seat again. Outside, the highway moves in steady lines, engines passing with restrained insistence. Late morning brings no regulars. A delivery truck slows, but does not enter the lot. Elena studies the door less frequently now. The faucet in the kitchen stays silent, tightened beyond patience. The radio murmurs about distant snow and open roads. None of it alters the room. By afternoon, light falls directly on the rose, revealing the split more clearly. The bent petal trembles slightly when the door opens for a brief customer who orders coffee to go. When the door closes, the petal steadies again. Elena watches the motion cease. As evening lowers, she switches on the blue sign outside. Its glow merges with the counter lamp, framing the rose in cool light. She turns off the overhead fixtures and stands still for a moment. The flower remains upright despite its fracture. Elena locks the door and rests her palm against the counter's edge. Beyond the glass, the highway extends without deviation. Inside, nothing asks to be repaired. The 21st morning carries a thin brightness that exposes more than it warms. Elena unlocks the blue neon and notices how the light reaches deeper into the room, touching the far wall before the lamps are switched on. She stands behind the counter and observes the rose in natural light. The split at the base of the bent petal has deepened, a hairline opening that cannot be closed. She does not move it. The vase remains within its faint ring on the counter. Coffee begins its descent into the pot, the sound steady and indifferent. The corner chair continues to face the window. Dust has settled into its grain, becoming part of it rather than resting upon it. Near mid-morning, a man in work boots steps inside, carrying the smell of sawdust. He orders black coffee and studies the room as though measuring its dimensions. His eyes pause on the rose longer than most. "Plastic lasts," he says without emphasis. Elena nods once and refills his cup. He leaves before finishing it. The faucet in the kitchen remains silent, tightened beyond dripping. The absence of sound feels deliberate. Elena wipes the counter, tracing the faint ring beneath the vase, but leaving it intact. Outside, the highway moves beneath the sky without clouds, trucks passing in clean intervals. By afternoon, the light shifts and strikes the rose directly. The bent petal trembles once when the door opens for a brief customer who pays an exact change. After the door closes, the tremor subsides. Elena steadies the vase with her fingertips, not correcting, only ensuring it remains upright. As evening settles, she switches on the blue sign outside. Its glow cools the room into a uniform shade. She turns off the overhead lights and leaves the counter lamp burning. The rose stands within the narrow circle, split visible, petal angled outward like a quiet declaration. Elena locks the door and looks once toward the highway. It continues without pause. Inside, the room accepts the fracture as part of its design. The 22nd morning begins with a dry, colorless light that reaches the counter before Elena touches the switches. She unlocks the blue neon and stands still, letting the brightness settle across the surface. The rose is already exposed, its bent petal casting a thin, angled shadow even without the lamp. She moves behind the counter and studies the split at the base. It has widened enough to create a slight gap where the material no longer meets. She does not attempt to press it together. Instead, she adjusts the vase so it sits exactly within the faded ring on the counter. Alignment is still possible, even if repair is not. Coffee drips into the pot. She pours a single cup and leaves it cooling beside the register. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, unchanged. Outside, the highway carries a steady line of vehicles beneath a cloudless sky, none slow. Late morning brings a traveling salesman who speaks too loudly about routes and contracts. He sits at the counter and taps his fingers against the surface, close to the vase. The rose trembles slightly with each impact. Elena places his plate down carefully, creating a small barrier of space. He eats quickly and leaves a business card she does not pick up. The faucet stays silent. The radio hums softly with distant reports. In the afternoon, the light shifts and strikes the crack directly, making it appear deeper than it is. Elena rests her hand on the counter beside the vase, not touching it, only measuring the distance. At dusk, she turns on the blue sign outside and dims the room. The counter lamp isolates the rose once more. The bent petal leans outward, the split visible but not catastrophic. Elena locks the door and pauses before leaving the counter. Beyond the glass, the highway recedes into evening, exact and unaltered. Inside, the fracture remains, neither hidden nor mended. The 23rd morning arrives under a sky bleached almost white. Elena unlocks the blue neon and feels the brightness enter before she does. Dust on the floor shows clearly now, each grain distinct. She turns on no lights at first. The rose stands in full exposure, its bent petal outlined sharply against the counter. The split has widened just enough to change the silhouette. A narrow gap lets light pass through where solid color once was. Elena leans closer, examining the scene without touching it. The vase remains steady within its ring. She considers moving it to the center again, then leaves it where it has been these past days. Coffee brews with its usual cadence. She pours a cup and lets it cool untouched. The corner chair remains angled, a fixed gesture toward the window. Outside, the highway moves in disciplined intervals, trucks maintaining distance as if following invisible rules. No one enters during the first hour. Near midday, a man in a dark jacket steps inside and stands longer than necessary before choosing a seat. He orders soup and watches Elena as she moves. His gaze pauses at the rose, then at the cracked petal. "Everything breaks," he says, not unkindly. She nods once and clears his bowl when he is finished. He leaves exact change. In the afternoon, heat gathers despite the pale sky. The sign outside flickers once, then steadies. The faucet remains dry. Elena wipes the counter, careful not to disturb the vase. The split in the petal catches the light differently now, producing a thin, bright line. As dusk approaches, she switches on the blue sign and dims the room. The counter lamp casts a precise circle. The rose stands within it, bent petal separated slightly from the stem, but still attached. Elena locks the door and stands facing the highway. It continues to withdraw into distance. Inside, the room absorbs another day without alteration. The 24th morning carries a thin veil of heat already rising from the asphalt. Elena unlocks the blue neon and senses the change before she crosses the threshold. The air inside feels lighter, almost hollow. She leaves the lights off and lets the natural glare define the room. The rose stands clearly visible, its bent petal now angled far enough to create a small, permanent gap. She steps closer and notices a faint crease forming near the stem, a second weakness beginning to declare itself. She does not touch it. The vase remains anchored within its pale ring on the counter. The outline has darkened over time, a subtle stain of repetition. Coffee begins to brew, steady and unremarkable. The first customer of the day is a delivery driver who lingers at the counter longer than necessary. He drums his fingers lightly, causing the vase to tremble. Elena steadies it with a flat palm. The rose regains stillness immediately. The driver pays and leaves without finishing his cup. By midday, the heat presses against the windows. The corner chair holds its angle toward the glass, dust barely visible in the brightness. No sign of Miller. Elena wipes the counter once, then stops halfway, leaving a faint arc of moisture that dries into nothing. Outside, the highway shimmers in the rising temperature. In the afternoon, the sign above the door flickers under strain, its blue glow unstable in daylight. The faucet remains silent, tightened beyond sound. Elena aligns the receipts from the previous week into a clean stack and places them beneath the register. The rose casts a sharper shadow now, its separation more pronounced. As evening lowers, she switches on the sign fully and dims the room. The counter lamp isolates the vase again. The bent petal leans outward as if preparing to detach, but it holds. Elena locks the door and remains behind the counter a moment longer. Beyond the glass, the highway glows faintly in residual heat, extending forward without invitation. Inside, the fracture waits without urgency. The 25th morning begins before the heat has fully risen. Elena unlocks the blue neon and notices how the air feels thinner, as if something has already been removed. The light enters cleanly, without resistance. She does not switch on the lamps. The rose stands exposed in the pale brightness, its bent petal now hanging at a sharper angle than before. The split at the base has widened enough to form a visible separation. A narrow thread of plastic still holds the petal to the stem. Elena leans closer, studying the point of connection. She does not attempt to reinforce it. The vase remains steady inside its darkened ring. Coffee begins its familiar drip behind her, unchanged. Near mid-morning, a truck pulls into the lot and idles longer than usual. The driver steps inside, orders black coffee, and stands at the counter. His sleeve brushes the vase lightly. The rose tilts, the bent petal trembling. Elena steadies it with 2 fingers. The driver leaves without noticing the shift he caused. By noon, the heat presses hard against the windows. The corner chair remains angled toward the highway, untouched. No one occupies it. Elena wipes the counter in slow arcs, careful not to disturb the vase. The faucet stays silent. The radio murmurs about clear roads stretching west. In the afternoon, a sudden gust slips through the door when a customer enters briefly. The air catches the weakened petal. It bends farther, the thin plastic thread straining. Elena watches without intervening. The customer pays and leaves. The door closes. The petal remains attached, but barely. As dusk settles, she switches on the blue sign and dims the interior. The counter lamp frames the rose in cool light. The petal hangs outward, nearly separated, casting a longer shadow than the stem itself. Elena locks the door and stands still behind the counter. Outside, the highway extends in precise lines into the fading heat. Inside, the petal waits at the edge of detachment, held by a single fragile connection. The 26th morning arrives with wind strong enough to press against the door before Elena unlocks it. The blue neon resists briefly, then yields. Inside, the air feels unsettled. She switches on the counter lamp. The rose stands where it has always stood, but the bent petal now hangs by a nearly invisible filament. She does not approach it immediately. Coffee begins to drip, steady as ever. The wind rattles the sign outside in uneven pulses. Dust moves along the floor in faint currents. When she finally steps closer, she sees that the thread of plastic is thinned to a pale strand, stretched almost transparent in the light. Late morning brings a pair of construction workers escaping the wind. They speak loudly, their jackets shedding grit onto the tiles. One of them sets his glove down too near the vase. The counter vibrates. The rose shivers once. Elena's hand moves toward it, but stops halfway. The men finish quickly and leave the door open a fraction too long before it shuts. The gust that follows enters the room with sharp intention. It reaches the counter and lifts the weakened petal outward. There is no sound when it separates, only a subtle shift in balance. The petal drops beside the vase, landing without drama. The stem remains upright. Elena looks at the fallen piece for several seconds. The crack at its base is clean now, final. She does not pick it up immediately. The room settles back into its usual stillness. Coffee continues to drip. The radio murmurs about wind advisories further east. By evening, she switches on the blue sign and dims the lights. The rose stands incomplete within the lamp's circle, its absence visible in the space where the petal once held shape. The detached piece rests on the counter, small and red against the worn surface. Elena locks the door and leaves both as they are. Outside, the highway moves under the wind without interruption. Inside, the fracture has completed itself. The 27th morning opens with a quieter wind. Elena unlocks the blue neon and notices the fallen petal immediately. It lies where it landed, a small red shape against the counter's worn surface. The stem stands upright, incomplete but steady. She turns on the counter lamp before anything else, isolating both pieces within its narrow light. She picks up the detached petal carefully. It is lighter than she expected, its edge sharp where it separated. The fracture line is clean, almost deliberate. For a moment, she holds it beside the stem, testing alignment without attempting realignment. The gap is exact. She places the petal on the counter to the right of the vase. Not hiding it, coffee begins its steady drip. Outside, the highway moves under a pale sky. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, unchanged by the night. Elena wipes the counter in slow arcs, stopping before she reaches the fallen piece. The faucet in the kitchen remains silent. Late morning brings a lone traveler who sits at the counter. His eyes pause on the incomplete rose, then shift to the detached petal resting nearby. He says nothing. Elena serves his coffee without comment. When he leaves, he places exact change beside the cup, careful not to disturb the small red fragment. In the afternoon, light shifts across the counter and strikes the broken edge directly. The separation casts two distinct shadows, now one from the stem, one from the petal. Elena watches the way they never meet. She does not move either piece. As evening settles, she switches on the blue sign outside and dims the room. The counter lamp frames the vase and the fallen petal within the same circle of light. The space between them remains precise, intentional. Elena locks the door and stands for a moment facing the highway. It continues without pause. Inside, the rose no longer pretends to be whole, and nothing attempts to restore it. The 28th morning begins without wind. Elena unlocks the blue neon and steps into a room that feels settled, almost resigned. The fallen petal remains where she left it, a separate form beside the vase. She switches on the counter lamp. The stem casts a thinner shadow now, altered by absence. She does not touch either piece. Coffee begins to drip behind her, patient and exact. The faint ring beneath the vase has darkened further, a permanent trace of position. Outside, the highway carries its steady procession beneath a washed sky. Vehicles pass with measured distance, none turning in. Mid-morning brings a postal worker who stands at the counter to drink his coffee. His gaze rests briefly on the detached petal. Still standing, he remarks quietly, though it is unclear which part he means. Elena nods once. He leaves a folded receipt and departs without hurry. The corner chair remains angled toward the window. Dust has settled evenly again, softening its outline. Elena lowers the blinds halfway to reduce the glare. The light changes, flattening the colors of the room. The rose appears duller, its separation less dramatic in shadow. In the afternoon, the faucet remains silent. The radio murmurs about distant traffic advisories. Elena wipes the counter carefully, leaving the space between stem and petal untouched. The gap feels deliberate now, no longer fragile. As dusk lowers, she switches on the blue sign and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp frames both pieces in a single circle. The stem stands upright. The petal rests apart, casting its own small shadow. Elena locks the door and stands facing the highway. It stretches forward in precise lines, indifferent to what has detached behind the glass. Inside, the room accepts the new shape without resistance. The 29th morning arrives under a sky so clear it seems unreal. Elena unlocks the blue neon and pauses just inside the doorway. The room feels lighter, as if something has been subtracted beyond the petal. She turns on the counter lamp. The stem and the fallen piece stand within the same pale circle, separate but balanced. She reaches for the detached petal for the first time since placing it there. Its edge is clean, the color slightly darker with a plastic tour. She turns it once in her fingers, testing its weight, then sets it back down, this time a little farther from the vase. The space widens by a few centimeters. The stem remains upright, unchanged. Coffee drips into the pot with its usual restraint. Outside, the highway moves in long, uninterrupted lines. A freight truck slows as if considering the entrance, then continues west. Elena watches the reflection pass across the window and disappear. The corner chair remains angled toward the road, untouched. Late morning brings a man in a faded uniform who sits at a table instead of the counter. He studies the room quietly, his eyes settling on the separated rows. He does not comment. Elena serves him without pause. When he leaves, he adjusts the chair back into alignment with the table before stepping outside. In the afternoon, the light shifts and exposes the darker ring beneath the vase more clearly. Elena wipes around it, but does not attempt to erase it. The faucet remains silent. The radio speaks of clear conditions ahead. She rests her hand briefly beside the vase, feeling the smooth surface under her palm. As evening settles, she switches on the blue sign and dims the room. The counter lamp frames the stem and the distant petal within the same glow, though the gap between them is more pronounced now. Elena locks the door and looks toward the highway. It continues to withdraw into distance without hesitation. Inside, the separation has become arrangement. The 30th morning begins with a faint haze rising from the asphalt. Elena unlocks the blue neon and steps inside without pausing. The room feels precise, arranged by repetition. She switches on the counter lamp. The stem and the detached petal stand apart within the light, the distance between them now intentional. She studies the darker ring beneath the vase. It has settled into the counter like a permanent mark, deeper than the surface stain suggests. Without ceremony, she lifts the vase and moves it slightly beyond the old outline into untouched space. The pale circle remains visible where it stood for weeks. The stem appears smaller in its new position. Coffee drips behind her. The sound remains constant, indifferent to change. She leaves the fallen petal where it rests, no longer adjusting it to maintain symmetry. Outside, the highway carries a steady line of vehicles under a colorless sky. None slow. Late morning brings no regulars. A traveler stops briefly, orders coffee to go, and leaves before the steam fades. Elena wipes the counter, passing over the old ring without trying to erase it. The mark persists, a faint memory of weight. In the afternoon, light shifts and strikes the relocated vase. The missing petal is more obvious from this angle. The stem casts a narrower shadow. The detached piece remains isolated, its own outline defined against the worn surface. The faucet stays silent. The radio murmurs about open roads and distant weather. As evening lowers, she switches on the blue sign and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp frames the rose in its new place, the empty circle visible behind it. Elena locks the door and rests her hand briefly on the old ring before turning away. Beyond the glass, the highway extends forward in unwavering lines. Inside, the absence has become part of the design. The 31st morning arrives with a dull silver sky. Elena unlocks the blue neon and enters without looking toward the highway. The room feels balanced in its rearrangement. She turns on the counter lamp. The vase stands in its new position, the old ring visible a short distance behind it like a faded boundary. The detached petal remains where she last left it, farther from the stem than before. Dust has gathered lightly along its edge, softening its red into something muted. Elena picks it up and brushes it clean with her thumb. The torn edge is rigid, unyielding. She does not attempt to return it to the stem. Coffee drips steadily. Outside, the highway moves under a low cloud cover. A truck slows briefly and continues east. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, unoccupied. Elena lowers it from the table and straightens its legs with deliberate care, though she leaves its direction unchanged. Late morning brings a woman traveling alone. She sits at the counter and studies the old ring on the surface, rather than the rose itself. "You moved it," she says quietly, not asking why. Elena nods once. The woman finishes her coffee and leaves without further comment. In the afternoon, light shifts and reveals the difference between old and new positions more clearly. The ring looks darker than the surrounding surface. Elena wipes around it, but does not attempt to polish it away. The faucet remains silent. The radio hums without clarity. As evening settles, she switches on the blue sign outside and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp isolates the vase in its new place, the empty circle behind it casting a faint shadow of memory. The detached petal rests apart, separate and intact. Elena locks the door and stands facing the highway for a moment. It continues without pause. Inside, the room has accepted the displacement without resistance. The 30-second morning begins with a brittle brightness that makes the counter appear almost white. Elena unlocks the blue neon and steps inside without hesitation. The vase remains in its new position. The old ring sits behind it like a quiet boundary, no longer enforced. She turns on the counter lamp, though the daylight already exposes everything. The detached petal lies where she last placed it, a small red fragment against the worn surface. Elena lifts it once more and turns it in her hand. The torn edge catches the light, sharp and exact. Without ceremony, she sets it down inside the empty ring where the vase once stood. The fragment fits within the outline as if it had been waiting. Coffee drips steadily behind her. The sound fills the room with its measured insistence. Outside, the highway carries its procession beneath the sky without variation. No one enters during the first hour. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, holding its silent position. Late morning brings a single customer who orders coffee to go. His eyes pass over the counter but linger nowhere. Elena hands him the cup without speaking. When the door closes, the room returns to its contained stillness. The faucet remains silent. The radio murmurs about clear conditions westbound. In the afternoon, light shifts and reveals the new arrangement more clearly. The vase stands forward, intact but incomplete. Behind it, inside the darkened ring, the detached petal rests alone, occupying the space that once belonged to the whole. The separation now spans distance. As evening lowers, she switches on the blue sign and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp frames both positions within a single glow of the upright stem in front, the fallen petal behind. Elena locks the door and rests her palm briefly on the counter between them. Beyond the glass, the highway extends in unwavering lines. Inside, the displacement has settled into order. The 33rd morning comes under a sky the color of faded aluminum. Elena unlocks the blue neon and enters without pause. The arrangement on the counter greets her immediately. The vase forward in its new place, the detached petal resting inside the dark ring behind it. The distance between them feels measured, no longer accidental. She turns on the counter lamp. Though the daylight is sufficient, she does not move either piece. Coffee begins to drip in the kitchen, steady and restrained. The sound carries into the room with familiar patience. Outside, the highway runs in long, straight lines beneath a muted horizon. A tractor trailer slows slightly, then continues without turning. Mid-morning brings a young mechanic who sits at the counter rather than a table. His gaze settles on the old ring and the petal resting inside it. He says nothing. Elena sets down his coffee and steps back. He leaves a coin near the vase, careful not to disturb it. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, unclaimed. Dust has settled evenly again, softening its edges. Elena lowers the blinds halfway, flattening the light across the counter. The vase casts a thinner shadow from its new position. A petal in the ring casts a separate, smaller one behind it. In the afternoon, the radio slips into static before finding a station. The faucet remains dry. Elena wipes the counter, circling around both positions without touching them. The old ring appears darker in contrast to the untouched surface around it. As evening settles, she switches on the blue sign outside and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp frames the vase and the petal within one quiet circle, separated by space and history. Elena locks the door and stands facing the highway for a moment. It continues to withdraw into distance. Inside, the room holds both the present position and the trace of what once stood whole. The 34th morning begins with a faint overcast that diffuses the light into something almost weightless. Elena unlocks the blue neon and steps inside without looking back at the parking lot. The counter holds its arrangement precisely. The vase forward, incomplete but upright. The detached petal resting inside the old ring behind it. She switches on the counter lamp out of habit, though the day already reveals everything. Coffee starts its steady descent into the pot. The sound carries through the quiet room. Elena runs her hand lightly across the counter between the two positions, feeling the smooth surface where repetition has worn it clean. She does not touch either the stem or the fallen piece. Late morning brings a highway patrol car that pauses outside longer than usual before moving on. No one enters. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, its presence now more symbolic than functional. Dust has settled evenly across its seat, as if sealing it in place. By midday, the sky clears. Sunlight strikes the counter directly, sharpening the contrast between old ring and new placement. The petal inside the ring appears almost centered within the faded outline, a deliberate occupation of absence. Elena studies the alignment without adjusting it. In the afternoon, a brief customer orders coffee and leaves quickly. The door opens and closes with restrained sound. The rose stem trembles slightly from the draft, then steadies. The petal inside the ring does not move. As evening lowers, she switches on the blue sign and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp frames both positions within a contained glow. The stem stands forward, incomplete but balanced. The petal rests in the ring, marking where fullness once stood. Elena locks the door and stands facing the highway. It continues without interruption. Inside, the room carries both absence and presence as equal parts of its design. The 35th morning arrives with a thin line of sunlight cutting across the counter before Elena touches the switch. She unlocks the blue neon and pauses just long enough to register the stillness. The vase stands forward in its chosen place, incomplete yet stable. Behind it, the detached petal rests inside the darkened ring, occupying absence with quiet precision. She turns on the counter lamp, though the day already makes everything visible. Coffee begins to drip in the kitchen, steady and exact. The sound fills the room without asking to be heard. Elena wipes the counter in slow arcs, stopping short of both positions. The surface between them feels worn smooth by repetition. Outside, the highway carries its disciplined procession beneath a pale sky. No vehicle turns in. Late morning brings no regulars. The corner chair remains angled toward the window, a fixed gesture toward movement that never arrives. Dust has settled evenly again, softening its outline. Elena lowers the blinds halfway, flattening the glare across the counter. The shadows of stem and petal fall in separate directions. In the afternoon, the radio murmurs about clear conditions and distant construction. The faucet remains silent. Elena studies the arrangement without adjustment. The petal inside the ring appears deliberate now, as if it has always belonged there. The stem forward casts a narrow shadow that does not reach it. As evening settles, she switches on the blue sign outside and dims the interior lights. The counter lamp frames both pieces within a contained circle of light, one upright, one resting behind in the outline of what once was. Elena locks the door and stands facing the highway for a long moment. It continues in unwavering lines toward distance. Inside, nothing seeks restoration. The design has completed itself. The air inside Miller's diner carried the weight of old grease and a storm that had not yet decided to break. Outside, the cornfields pressed against the windows like walls built from stalks and dust. They did not look like nature. They looked like something that kept a man in place. The vinyl on the chairs had split open in pale scars. A fly beat itself against the glass with blind persistence. Behind the counter, the bartender wiped the surface in the same slow arc he had traced for 30 years. Nothing happened. Even so, time lay on the tables like iron. Wesley sat near the window. 60. His jacket held the smell of diesel and cheap tobacco, as if both had seeped into the fabric permanently. He ordered coffee he did not intend to drink. At the far table, the sheriff rested his dusty boots on the floorboards and stared at nothing. They did not look at each other. Their silence was shared, like a tool passed back and forth. Men who have learned not to speak do not have to lie. In his pocket, Wesley touched the small piece of metal he carried, an old burned keychain. Its edge was jagged, and when he pressed it, it cut into his finger. He did not feel it. Objects were more faithful than memory. 30 years ago, the cornfields had burned not from sun, but from anger. The night had smelled of rubber and wet soil. He remembered a shoe left in a furrow, not the face. Never the face. The ceiling fan clicked in a steady rhythm, cutting the thick air into equal pieces. The sound irritated him and calmed him at once. It proved the world still turned. The sheriff stood, adjusted his belt, heavy as if underwater. The bartender poured too much coffee. It spilled into the saucer and spread in a brown circle that widened slowly, like an old grievance no one named. When the wind rose, the corn began to whisper. It was not a pleasant sound. It was dry, like thousands of tongues repeating something unfinished. Wesley stepped outside. The gas station light flickered above him. America here looked exhausted, selling itself piece by piece. A car with foreign plates rolled into town, tires lifting dust in a thin cloud. It was a small thing, but it disturbed the settled mud. Wesley watched until the dust fell back to earth. Secrets are never buried. They only grow weeds. The car with foreign plates stopped near the gas pump, engine idling longer than necessary. Its paint was clean in a town that had forgotten polish. Wesley stood beneath the flickering light and watched the driver step out, a man too young to belong to these roads, his shoes unstained by field dust. He looked around as if searching for something that had once stood here and failed to remain. The wind pressed the corn into restless motion behind them. Inside the diner, the bell above the door rang with a tired metallic note. Conversations did not pause. There had been none to interrupt. The bartender glanced up once, then returned to his cloth and counter. The young man chose a table near the window. He asked for directions to the old mill. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone pretending not to know more than he should. The sheriff's chair was empty now, but his absence felt deliberate. Wesley returned to his seat. He did not look at the stranger directly. Instead, he watched the reflection in the darkened glass. The man's hands trembled slightly when he lifted his cup, not from cold, from recognition. Wesley felt the burned metal in his pocket grow heavier. Outside, thunder rolled far across the flatland, too distant to be urgent. 30 years compress easily when no one speaks of them. The fire had eaten the corn in long red corridors. The town had gathered in silence the next morning and agreed on what it had not seen. A factory was still open then. Wages still arrived on Fridays. Truth would have cost more than it could buy. Wesley remembered the smell of scorched rubber again, sharp and sweet. He kept his eyes on the table. The stranger rose first. He left money beside the untouched pie and stepped back into the wind. Wesley waited before following. The storm finally broke, rain striking the asphalt in hard, scattered drops. In the distance, the cornfields bent but did not fall. He understood then that some returns are not about justice. They are about witness. He lit a cigarette, and let the rain fall through the smoke. Rain settled into a steady fall, flattening the dust and turning the parking lot into a dull sheet of reflected light. Wesley followed at a distance. The stranger walked toward the road that led past the abandoned mill. He did not hesitate. He walked as if he had studied a map long before arriving. The town offered no directions, yet he seemed guided by something older than signs. The mill stood against the horizon, like a ribcage picked clean. Its windows were broken. Its doors hung loose on one hinge. Water slipped through the cracked roof and fell inside with a patient echo. Wesley stopped near the fence line. The stranger moved closer to the entrance, then paused. For a moment, neither man spoke. The rain softened the world around them. Even the corn had fallen quiet. "You were here," the stranger said without turning. It was not accusation. It was inventory. Wesley watched the back of the man's jacket darken under the rain. He could have denied it. The town had practiced denial for decades. Instead, he said nothing. Silence was still the safest language here. Inside the mill, the floorboards sagged where fire had once licked through the beams. The stranger stepped carefully, as if expecting the past to shift beneath his weight. He bent and lifted something from the ground, a rusted buckle, half buried in ash that had turned to dust. His hand closed around it with a familiarity that did not belong to discovery. Wesley felt the old keychain in his pocket. The cut on his finger had begun to sting now that the rain had reached it. He understood that the young man had not come for confession. He had come for confirmation. The storm moved east. Water ran through the ditches toward the fields. The mill remained standing, though nothing inside it worked anymore. They stood beneath the broken roof while the rain threaded through the beams. The stranger held the rusted buckle in his palm as if it were fragile glass. He did not look at Wesley. He looked at the floor, at the blackened wood, at the place where the fire had once taken hold. "My father worked here," he said. The words were plain. They did not ask for sympathy. Wesley nodded once. The gesture was small, almost mechanical. He remembered the night shift whistle that had once split the dark. He remembered men stepping out with grease on their hands and flour on their jackets from the grain mill next door. He remembered how quickly flames erase routines. The town had called it an accident before the smoke had thinned. The stranger crouched and brushed ash aside with his fingers. The motion was patient, deliberate. "They said he left," he added. Rain struck the tin roof in uneven rhythms. Wesley watched water collect along a beam and fall in steady drops. Leaving had been easier than explaining. The factory had still been open then. The town had still depended on silence. Wesley finally spoke. "People leave," he said. It was the kind of sentence that fits anywhere. The stranger rose slowly. His eyes were steady now, no longer searching the floor. "Not without boots," he replied. The word hung in the damp air between them. Outside, the fields shimmered under the rain. The corn bent but did not break. Wesley felt the weight of the burned keychain in his pocket again. He understood that the boy knew. The man was not chasing ghosts. He was measuring the size of a lie. And the lie, like the mill, was still standing. The rain thinned to a mist, leaving the mill wrapped in a gray quiet. Water gathered in shallow pools along the warped floorboards. The stranger slipped the rusted buckle into his pocket, as if it were something alive. Wesley stepped back toward the doorway. The fields beyond the fence lay flattened in places where the wind had pressed too hard. Nothing looked repaired, only rearranged. "You were there," the stranger said again, this time without anger. It was a statement placed carefully, like a stone. Wesley felt the old cut on his finger reopen against the metal in his pocket. He did not reach for it. He remembered the circle of men under the burning sky, the way no one met another's eyes. He remembered how quickly decisions are made when they protect wages and mortgages. "He ran," Wesley said at last. The word felt dry in his mouth. It was what they had agreed upon. It was what had allowed the factory to reopen 2 weeks later. The stranger studied him. Rainwater traced a line down his cheek, but it was not from the storm. There was a ditch, the stranger replied quietly, near the west field. He did not say more. He did not need to. Wesley saw it again, the dark trench at the edge of the corn, the boot half buried in mud, the smell of scorched rubber carried by a restless wind. He had stood there and turned away. The mist began to lift. Somewhere in town, a truck engine started. Life resumed its ordinary volume. Wesley felt something loosen inside him. Not relief, not confession-only fatigue. He took the burned keychain from his pocket and placed it on the damp floor between them. It lay there without ceremony. The stranger did not pick it up. He only looked at it, as if measuring whether the weight of metal could equal the weight of 30 years. The keychain lay between them, darkened by water, its edges blunt from years of being carried and pressed. For a moment, neither man moved. The mill smelled of wet timber and old smoke that never entirely leaves. Outside, the last of the storm dragged itself across the fields, low and reluctant. The stranger looked at the metal, then at Wesley, as if comparing two versions of the same ruin. "You kept it," he said. Wesley shrugged. The gesture was tired, almost apologetic. "It was there," he answered. He did not add that he had picked it up before the others arrived, that he had slipped it into his pocket, as if that small theft could contain the night. Objects are easier to carry than words. They do not argue back. The stranger stepped closer, but did not touch the keychain. "They told my mother he drove away," he said. His voice was steady now. "They said he owed money." The mill answered with a hollow drip from the ceiling. Wesley remembered the meeting in the diner the next morning. Coffee cups lined up like witnesses. The sheriff speaking about stability. The factory owner speaking about responsibility. No one speaking about the ditch. Wesley felt the fatigue deepen. Not fear, not shame, something heavier and more ordinary. "We needed the plant open," he said. It was not justification. It was arithmetic. Jobs against one man. Mortgage payments against smoke. The stranger listened without interruption. He had likely done the math already. At last the stranger bent and picked up the keychain. He weighed it in his palm, then closed his fist around it. "I don't need a confession," he said. "I needed to know it wasn't just a story." Wesley nodded. The rain stopped entirely. In the distance, the town's lights flickered on one by one. Nothing had changed. The mill still leaned. The field still stood. But the silence between them no longer belonged only to the town. They walked back toward town without speaking. The road had turned to dark ribbon under the rain, reflecting a pale sky that was already losing color. The stranger kept his hands in his pockets. Wesley walked a step behind, as if escorting something fragile. The cornfield stood upright again, water clinging to the leaves like a thin varnish. From a distance, they looked clean. At the edge of town, the stranger stopped near the low stone wall by the cemetery. The headstones leaned slightly, as if listening. "There's no grave," he said. It was not a question. Wesley shook his head. The town had buried nothing. It had only continued. The stranger looked across the rows of names and dates. 30 years compress easily when there is no marker. "I won't stay," the stranger said after a while. "There's nothing here for me." His voice carried no bitterness. It was a simple conclusion. Wesley understood. This town keeps what is silent and pushes away what asks. The factory had closed 5 years after the fire anyway. The arithmetic had been temporary. They stood there until the last light drained from the sky. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell quiet. Wesley felt the absence of the keychain in his pocket, like a missing tooth. Lighter, but noticeable. The stranger turned toward the road without offering a hand. There was nothing to seal. Wesley watched the car's taillights recede along the highway, 2 small red points swallowed by distance. The night settled in fully now. He remained by the cemetery wall, hands empty, breathing the damp air. The town behind him hummed in its usual patient way. Tomorrow, the diner would open. The fan would click. The corn would whisper. And the fields would keep what they were given. Morning came without ceremony. A thin gray light spread across the fields, revealing nothing new. Wesley sat in Miller's before the first truckers arrived. The air still carried yesterday's grease and something faintly metallic from the storm. The bartender nodded once, no questions. The world had reset itself with mechanical precision. He ordered coffee and drank it this time. It was bitter and hot, ordinary. Outside, the highway hummed with early traffic. No foreign plates stood out now. Dust rose and settled, as it always had. The town did not look wounded. It looked functional. That was enough for most people. At the far end of the counter, the sheriff's empty chair remained pushed slightly back, as if someone had just stood up. Wesley watched the ceiling fan trace its slow circle. The clicking was still there, reliable, predictable. He placed his hand in his pocket by habit and found nothing. The absence no longer cut. It simply existed. A delivery truck passed, carrying grain toward a city that would never know this place. Wesley thought of the mill, of wet boards and rusted metal. He thought of the stranger's steady voice. Nothing had been repaired, nothing restored, but something had shifted its weight. When he stepped outside, the cornfields shimmered under a pale sun. They did not look like prison walls now. They looked like distance. Wesley lit a cigarette and watched the smoke lift straight into the still air. The town would continue, with or without memory. He understood that endurance is not forgiveness. It is only repetition. By afternoon, the sun had hardened the mud into cracked plates. The storm was already a rumor told by damp ditches and flattened grass. Wesley drove out toward the west field in his old pickup, the engine coughing once before settling into its familiar rhythm. The road was narrow, bordered by corn that rose higher than the cab. From inside, it felt like moving through a corridor without doors. He stopped where the ditch cut across the edge of the field. The water had thinned to a shallow, slow current. Mud clung to the banks in dark layers. He stood there for a long time, hands at his sides, as if waiting for instruction. 30 years earlier, the ground had been softer. There had been shouting. Then agreement. The kind that does not need signatures. The field was quiet now. No smoke, no witnesses. Only insects tracing invisible paths above the stalks. Wesley stepped down into the ditch. The mud pulled at his boots with a patient grip. He looked at the place where the furrow had once been disturbed. It was impossible to tell one patch of earth from another. Land forgets faster than men. He did not dig. He did not kneel. He only stood there until the sun shifted and his shadow shortened. The arithmetic had never been precise. One life weighed against a factory that would close anyway. One silence traded for years of routine. The numbers had not held. When he climbed back up, he felt no revelation. Only heat pressing against his back. The corn moved slightly in the wind, a dry, indifferent whisper. Wesley returned to the truck and started the engine. The ditch remained as it was, shallow, unmarked, sufficient. The town would not come here. It never had. Toward evening, he drove again, slower this time. The sky had turned the color of old tin. Wesley left the truck by the gravel shoulder and walked into the field without looking back. The corn closed around him, dry leaves brushing his jacket with a papery sound. There was no path, only repetition of stalk after stalk, each identical to the next. He stopped near the place where the ditch bent toward the road. The ground was firm now, hardened by sun. He stood there and removed his jacket. The fabric still held diesel and tobacco, a portable history. He folded it once and laid it over the nearest stalk, where it hung awkwardly, too heavy for something so thin. From his shirt pocket, He took out a pack of cigarettes and a matchbook. He struck one match and watched it flare briefly in the wind. For a second he smelled it, the same sharp scent that had filled the air 30 years ago. Burned rubber, dry husk, panic. The flame shrank to nothing before touching the leaves. He dropped the match and crushed it under his heel. Wesley did not try again. Fire requires intent. He had none left. Instead, he reached into the soil with his hands and pulled loose a small clump of earth. It came away easily. He placed it in his palm and let it crumble back down. The field did not resist. It did not remember. When he returned to the road, the jacket remained behind, caught between two stalks like an abandoned sign. He did not retrieve it. The truck engine started on the second turn. As he drove back toward town, the corn swallowed the patch where he had stood. Nothing burned, nothing surfaced. The horizon darkened steadily, without promise. Night settled without wind. The town lights flickered on one by one, patient and indifferent. Wesley drove with the window open, the air cooler now, stripped of storm and heat. He did not look toward the field again. In the rearview mirror, there was only darkness and the faint outline of corn. The jacket would hang there until morning, then fall, then disappear into the rows. He parked beside Miller's. The neon sign trembled in weak red pulses, a tired artery above the highway. Inside, the diner carried its usual weight of oil and coffee. The bartender glanced at him, paused for a fraction of a second at the sight of his missing jacket, and said nothing. Silence had always been the town's most dependable habit. Wesley took his seat near the window. The vinyl cracked softly beneath him. A ceiling fan clicked in its old rhythm. A truck roared past outside, headlights sweeping across the walls before vanishing. For a moment, the room looked almost clean under that brief white light. Then it returned to its usual dimness. He ordered coffee and drank it slowly. The bitterness was direct, uncomplicated. At the far end of the counter, someone spoke about rising fuel prices. Another voice answered. The words drifted without weight. No one mentioned the mill. No one mentioned a ditch. The arithmetic of survival had been completed long ago. When he stepped back outside, the highway hummed steadily. The cornfields were invisible now, reduced to a dark mass against the sky. Wesley stood beneath the flickering gas station light and lit a cigarette. The smoke rose straight up, undisturbed. He understood that nothing had been undone. The town would continue, and he would sit in his place tomorrow, and the fan would click, and the fields would keep what they were given. Dawn arrived pale and unconvincing. A thin mist lay over the highway, softening the outlines of trucks and telephone poles. Wesley had not gone home. He had sat in the pickup until the sky began to lighten, the engine off, the metal cooling around him. The town looked smaller at that hour, as if night had folded it in on itself. He stepped out and walked toward the diner again. Miller's opened its door with the same reluctant chime. The bartender was already there, sleeves rolled up, wiping the counter in a motion that did not require thought. He glanced at Wesley's shirt sleeves, at the absence of the jacket, then filled a cup without being asked. Routine is a form of mercy. Outside, a farm truck passed slowly, loaded with feed. Life moved forward in narrow lanes. Wesley wrapped both hands around the cup. The heat traveled into his fingers, steady and plain. He felt no urgency, no new clarity. Only the quiet subtraction of something he had carried too long. A woman entered to buy cigarettes. She spoke about the weather turning colder. The bartender nodded. Wesley listened to their voices as if they belonged to another room. 30 years had not collapsed. They had merely settled, like dust after machinery stops. When the sun finally cleared the horizon, it painted the corn with a thin gold that did not promise harvest. Wesley finished his coffee and stood. He left money on the counter and walked outside. The field stretched out under the new light, endless and restrained. He did not look toward the west ditch. He did not need to. The town had resumed its pulse, and he stepped back into it without resistance. Sediment of a small town. Rain struck the tin roof of the silver smoke without rhythm, as if the sky had grown tired of insisting. Morning in the Montana town arrived in shades of metal. The sawmill across the road stood locked and rusted, its windows blind with dust. Inside the diner, steam rose from a black cup and disappeared before it reached the light. Miller watched it vanish. He had spent too many nights waiting for something that did not come. Coffee was simpler. It did not promise anything. His uniform hung on him like a borrowed coat. One button near his chest trembled when he moved, loose but still holding. He pressed it between two fingers and let it be. There were larger ruptures in the world than thread. His hands carried the smell of cheap tobacco and gun oil. He had washed them before coming in, but metal remained. Some things did. The waitress moved along the counter with a cloth, polishing the same strip of surface she had polished for 30 years. Her gestures were exact, almost ceremonial. Nothing changed under her hand. The bell above the door rang once. Cold air entered first, then the boy. Kane's sweatshirt was too large, the sleeves hiding his wrists. His eyes were not angry. They were simply tired, as if he had already seen how far the road went and found nothing at the end. They looked at each other without surprise. Recognition does not require warmth. Kane slid into the booth opposite him. A plastic menu lay between them like a document, neither intended to sign. Miller nudged the ashtray forward. It was the only object they could share without consequence. Outside, rain slid down the window and blurred the outline of the dead mill. Miller asked about the boy's mother. Kane answered with a shrug that seemed older than his body. The holster at Miller's side felt heavy and cold. He had carried it long enough to know it solved nothing. Still, it remained, like the badge, like the town, like the rain beating on tin. They sat across from each other while the morning thinned, two figures waiting in a room whose doors had already closed. Smoke gathered slowly between them, blue and patient. Kane lit the cigarette without asking permission. Miller did not object. He watched the boy's hands instead. They trembled once briefly before tightening into fists around the lighter. Youth was supposed to burn hot. This was different. This was a quiet shaking, like an engine running without fuel. Through the rain-blurred window, the sawmill stood as it always had in recent years, closed, locked, surrendered to rust. Miller remembered Kane's father walking out of that gate the last morning it operated, a lunchbox in his hand. No anger, only a kind of disbelief. After that, the man thinned into rumor, a job in Wyoming, a woman in Idaho. Eventually, nothing. Towns like this did not keep records of disappearances. They absorbed them. Miller reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded leaflet. The paper was yellowed, the corner soft from being carried too long. It advertised work in a neighboring county road repair, seasonal, temporary. Words printed in bold certainty. He placed it on the table between the coffee cups. It looked fragile there, like something excavated from another century. Kane stared at it without touching it. His eyes moved across the lines as if they belonged to a language he had never learned. Movement for the sake of movement. That was what he understood. Not schedules, not promises printed in ink. He took a slow drag and exhaled toward the ceiling. They lifted their cups at the same time. The gesture almost synchronized. The coffee had gone lukewarm. Miller felt the distance between them settle into its proper shape, neither hostility nor understanding, just two lives occupying the same square of air, while the rain continued its dull percussion above the roof. Kane spoke without looking up. He said he had taken a car. Not borrowed. Taken. The words fell flat on the table between the cups, dry and factual. There was no tremor now. Confession, when stripped of hope, becomes inventory. He named the street. A pickup left idling outside a grocery store that no longer sold fresh bread. Miller listened. The law required sequence. Questions, cuffs, a ride back through streets that had memorized his patrol lights. He felt the weight of the holster against his hip and placed his palm briefly over it, as if checking for a pulse. The metal answered with its usual cold. It had never solved the hunger. It had only recorded it. Rain intensified. Somewhere above them, water found a crack in the ceiling. It began to fall into a metal bucket in the corner, tink, tink steady, as a clock that had lost interest in hours. The sound pressed against Miller's thoughts. Across the table, Kane waited, not pleading, not defiant. Waiting was something he already knew how to do. Miller slid the leaflet aside. The paper scraped softly over laminate. Rescue, he understood, was often a way of defending one's own reflection. He reached into his wallet and drew out a single $20 bill. He placed it beneath the ashtray so it would not drift. Not payment, not absolution. Only a meal that would not need to be stolen. He stood. His knees answered with a quiet crack. Age did not negotiate. Kane took the money without thanks. Gratitude implied a future. Through the diner door, the boy stepped into the rain and folded into the gray distance. Miller remained a moment longer, looking at the empty cup, the full ashtray, the thin light spreading over wet asphalt. Then he put on his hat and walked out to begin the shift that had already begun years ago. The patrol car smelled of vinyl and old rain. Miller sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Drops slid down the windshield and merged, separating again without direction. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. He adjusted the rearview mirror and saw only the diner door behind him, already closed, already ordinary. He turned the key. The engine responded with a tired certainty. Across the street, the sawmill fence rattled in the wind. A loose sheet of tin tapped against a beam metal speaking to metal. He watched the road where Kane had disappeared. There were no footprints left in rain. The town erased what it could. A call came through from dispatch. A minor disturbance near the railroad tracks. Two men arguing over scrap metal that no longer had value. Miller answered in a voice that belonged to procedure. He pulled onto the road. Tires cut through shallow water and sent it outward in thin arcs. Movement, at least, could be relied upon. As he drove, storefronts passed in repetition. Boarded windows, faded sale signs, a barber pole that no longer turned. He remembered when the streets had carried sound. Now they carried residue. He stopped at a red light, though no one approached from either side. Habit remained where urgency had left. At the tracks, the argument had already ended. The men stood apart, breathing hard, ashamed of nothing in particular. Miller stepped out, hands resting near his belt. He separated them with a few quiet words. No citations, no lesson. The train line stretched beyond them into low cloud. When he returned to the car, the rain had begun again, steady and patient, as if nothing required conclusion. By afternoon, the rain had thinned into a pale mist that never fully touched the ground. Miller parked near the river where the water moved, slowly past broken reeds and discarded cans. He ate a sandwich wrapped in paper that had absorbed the grease. The bread tasted of nothing. Across the bank, an abandoned grain elevator leaned slightly, as if reconsidering its own balance. He thought of the boy, walking somewhere beyond the limits of town. 17 and already carrying the posture of a man who had misplaced something essential. Miller had seen that posture before outside courtrooms, inside hospital corridors, under bridges where men slept with their boots still on. It was not rebellion. It was erosion. The radio remained quiet. For a moment, he imagined driving west without reporting it. The highway would accept him without question. Gas stations, motels, other towns with other rusting mills. The uniform would still hang on his shoulders, but the faces would change. He knew the thought for what it was. a small fiction to measure the size of his cage. He finished the sandwich and wiped his hands on a napkin that dissolved at the edges. The smell of tobacco clung to his fingers again. In the reflection of the patrol car window, he saw a man shaped by routine more than choice. The badge caught a strip of weak light and returned it without warmth. When he started the engine, the sound seemed louder than necessary. He turned back toward town. The silver smoke would still be there, the bucket catching water, the waitress polishing the same counter. Somewhere in the gray distance, a boy would decide on his next movement. Miller drove on, not toward resolution, but toward the continuation of things that no longer asked to be understood. Evening came without color. The clouds lowered themselves over the town and pressed it flat. Miller parked again outside the silver smoke at the end of his shift. The neon sign buzzed weakly, the word smoke flickering as if uncertain of its own existence. He sat for a moment before stepping out. The day had passed, but nothing had moved. Inside, the waitress had changed her apron. The counter still shone in the same narrow strip beneath the lights. A different cup was placed before him, identical to the one from morning. He wrapped his hands around it and felt the heat travel slowly into his fingers. Across the room, the booth where Kane had sat remained empty. The vinyl held the shape of no one. He wondered where the boy would sleep. In a friend's garage. In the stolen truck if it still had fuel. Or nowhere at all. Miller did not imagine tragedy. He imagined continuation. A series of small decisions made without witness. The world did not end for boys like Kane. It thinned around them until they could pass through it unnoticed. The bucket in the corner still caught water from the ceiling. Tink, the rhythm had softened, but not stopped. Miller looked at the stain spreading above it. Repairs were always postponed in buildings like this. The structure learned to live with its own damage. When he finished the coffee, he left a few bills beneath the saucer and stood. Outside, the air was colder. The street lights had come on, casting pale circles on wet pavement. He adjusted his hat and walked toward his car. The town rested in a kind of exhausted peace. Somewhere beyond the dim glow, a young figure moved through darkness without destination. Miller did not follow. He began another shift that had no clear beginning and no visible end. Night settled fully after 9. The highway beyond town carried a few distant headlights, each one passing without slowing. Miller drove with the window slightly open. Cold air entered in measured drafts, carrying the scent of wet earth and diesel. The patrol car's dashboard clock glowed a steady green. Time, at least, maintained discipline. He took the long route past the trailer park near the railroad bend. A porch light flickered in one of the units where Kane had once lived. The door stood closed. No movement behind the thin curtains. Miller did not stop. He reduced speed, then let the car roll forward again. There are doors a man can knock on, and doors he has already closed by waiting too long. At the edge of town, he pulled over beside an empty field. The rain had stopped, leaving the soil dark and heavy. He stepped out and listened. Far away, a train horn carried across the flat land, low and indifferent. The sound did not belong to anyone in particular. It passed through him and continued on. He thought of the $20 bill and the way the boy had taken it without a word. Money could buy food. It could not buy direction. Miller understood that, now with a clarity that did not comfort him. He had chosen inaction, not out of mercy, but out of fatigue. The law had become a language he no longer believed in, yet still spoke fluently. When he returned to the car, the seat felt colder than before. He started the engine and turned back toward the center of town. Storefront windows reflected his headlights in dull rectangles. Somewhere in the dark, footsteps moved along gravel or pavement. He would not know whose. The night did not require answers. It required only that he remain awake. Just before midnight, a call came in about a stalled vehicle near the old bridge. Miller recognized the stretch of road before dispatch finished the address. He drove without haste. The river beneath the bridge moved black and without reflection. Mist hovered above it like breath held too long. The pickup stood angled near the guardrail, one door open. Its engine had gone quiet. Miller stepped out and saw the boy sitting on the hood, hands tucked beneath his sleeves. Kane did not appear surprised. The headlights illuminated him in pale certainty. Rainwater still clung to his hair. "It ran out," the boy said. No apology. No story constructed around the fact. The stolen truck had carried him only so far. Miller walked around it once, inspecting nothing in particular. The license plate confirmed what he already knew. Procedure hovered between them like a third presence. For a moment, neither moved. The river pressed against its banks below, patient and repetitive. Miller imagined the paperwork waiting on his desk, the report that would reduce the night to sentences. He also imagined the alternative, the cuffs, the juvenile cell, the cycle closing neatly where it had begun. He looked at Kane's face in the light, not defiant, not pleading, only tired. Miller took a slow breath and reached into the patrol car for a small red gas, and he kept for stranded motorists. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to the boy without comment. The metal touched metal softly. "This is the last," Miller said, though he did not specify what he meant. Kane nodded once. The river continued its dark movement. Above them, clouds shifted enough to reveal a lighter shade of gray. Not moonlight, just a thinner darkness over wet asphalt and two figures standing without promise. Kane poured the fuel carefully, both hands steady now. The thin stream glinted briefly in the patrol car's headlights before disappearing into the tank. Miller stood beside the open door, watching the boy's reflection in the truck's dull paint. The smell of gasoline mixed with river damp and cold metal. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic. It felt used. When the can was empty, Kane set it down on the pavement. He wiped his hands on his sweatshirt, leaving darker streaks that would dry without being noticed. Miller took the container back and placed it in his trunk. He did not mention ownership of the vehicle. He did not mention consequences. Words would have made the moment heavier than it already was. Kane turned the key. The engine coughed once, then caught. The sound was uneven but alive. For a second, it filled the space between them, louder than the river below. Miller met the boy's eyes through the open window. There was no gratitude there, only a brief acknowledgement that they occupied the same hour. "You'll bring it back," Miller said quietly. It was not a command. It was not even advice. It was something closer to a wish, spoken without expectation. Kane gave a small nod. He shifted into gear. The truck rolled forward, tires crunching over wet gravel before finding asphalt. Miller remained by the roadside until the taillights faded into the low mist. The bridge returned to its original silence. The river moved as it had before, indifferent to borrowed fuel and borrowed chances. He stood a moment longer, then returned to his car. The night had not changed. It had only deepened. The rest of the shift passed without urgency. A stray dog near the grain silos. A porch light reported broken, but merely loose in its socket. Miller answered each call with the same measured tone. The town did not demand heroism. It required maintenance. Near 2 a.m, he parked once more outside the silver smoke. The neon sign had been switched off. Only a single bulb above the door remained, casting a pale circle onto wet pavement. He did not go inside. Instead, he sat with the engine idling, listening to its low vibration through the steering wheel. He thought of the boy driving somewhere along the outer roads, the tank no longer empty. Whether Kane would return the truck or abandon it in another county did not alter the shape of the night. Miller understood that he had postponed something, not resolved it. Yet postponement in this town often passed for mercy. A thin wind moved through the street, lifting scraps of paper against the curb. The sawmill's silhouette stood unchanged against the horizon. Rust would continue its slow work. Buildings would settle deeper into themselves. Morning would arrive in the same restrained gray. Miller switched off the engine. Silence expanded inside the car. He removed his hat and rested it on the seat beside him. In the darkened window, his reflection appeared faint and uncertain, as if already receding. He remained there until the first trace of lighter sky edged the rooftops, then stepped out to begin another day that did not ask for belief. Dawn came without announcement. A thin seam of pale light opened above the rooftops and spread slowly across the street. Miller stood beside his car and watched the color of the asphalt change from black to a muted gray. The air carried the clean, metallic scent that follows rain. It felt temporary, like everything else. He drove home through empty streets. Curtains remained drawn. A newspaper lay unopened on a doorstep, already damp at the edges. At a stop sign, he paused longer than required, though no vehicles approached. Habit had become the only structure he trusted. Motion for its own sake felt too similar to escape. His house waited at the end of a narrow gravel drive. The porch light had burned through the night. He switched it off before entering. Inside, the rooms held a quiet that did not resent him but did not welcome him either. He removed the badge and placed it on the kitchen table. Without it, his shirt seemed lighter, though nothing else changed. In the bathroom mirror, he studied his face under the flat morning light. Lines had settled permanently around his mouth. His eyes looked less tired than hollow. He washed his hands, watching the water run clear. The smell of gasoline lingered faintly beneath the soap. He lay down on the couch instead of the bed. Through the window, the town began its slow return to activity. An engine starting somewhere, a door closing, distant tires on wet road. Miller closed his eyes, without certainty that sleep would follow. Outside, the day continued assembling itself piece by piece, indifferent to the choices made in the dark. Sleep came in fragments. Miller drifted for an hour, then surfaced again, as if pulled up by an unseen hand. The room had brightened. Light pressed flat against the walls, exposing dust on the bookshelf, and a crack in the ceiling paint he had stopped noticing. He remained on the couch, boots still on, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. A memory entered without permission. Kane's father leaning against a patrol car years earlier, speaking about overtime shifts and the promise of expansion at the mill. The man had believed in continuity. Miller remembered nodding, offering small reassurances that cost nothing at the time. The mill closed within 6 months. The father's voice disappeared from town shortly after. He sat up and removed his boots. Mud flaked onto the floorboards. He did not sweep it away. In the quiet, the house felt less like shelter and more like storage, a place to keep uniforms. Paperwork, old photographs face down in drawers. He opened one drawer now and looked at a picture of himself from 2 decades earlier. The badge had seemed fitted then. The phone on the kitchen counter rang once before stopping. A wrong number or a caller who reconsidered. He did not check. Some signals were meant to pass unanswered. He poured himself water instead of coffee and drank it slowly, as if testing whether clarity could be summoned through simple means. Outside, the sky had lifted to a uniform gray. The town would be moving fully by now. Kane might be returning the truck or driving farther than he intended. Miller stood at the window, watching a neighbor load tools into the back of a van. Movement again, always movement. He understood that inertia did not mean stillness. It meant continuing in the same direction long after the reason had faded. By late afternoon, he returned to the station. The building smelled of paper and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights hummed with steady indifference. Miller placed his hat on the desk and sat before the stack of unfinished reports. The blank form waiting for the stolen vehicle felt heavier than the rest. He typed slowly, location, time, observed condition. He left certain lines untouched. The section asking for arrest details remained empty. His fingers rested on the keyboard longer than necessary. There were ways to describe a night that did not include everything that had happened. Omission was not a lie. It was a narrowing of focus. Through the office window, he could see the courthouse steps across the street. 2 teenagers lingered there, passing a bottle between them in careless arcs. He did not recognize them. Or perhaps he chose not to. The town produced faces faster than it retained them. The radio on his desk murmured with distant chatter from another county. A deputy there spoke sharply about compliance and procedure. Miller lowered the volume. Words sounded different when carried through speakers. They lost weight. He signed the report with a firm line and set it aside. Outside, the sky dimmed again toward evening. The rhythm of the place had not shifted. Kane had not returned to the station. No complaint had been filed about the truck. The absence of consequence felt provisional. Miller leaned back in his chair and listened to the fluorescent hum, aware that the day had completed its circle without resolving anything at all. Near sunset, the truck was found parked behind the grocery store where it had been taken. The owner called it in without anger, only mild confusion. No damage, a quarter tank of fuel. Miller drove out to confirm what he already suspected. The engine was cool. The keys lay on the driver's seat. He stood beside the vehicle for a moment before closing the door. The parking lot held the faint smell of produce and wet cardboard. A shopping cart drifted slowly across the asphalt. Pushed by wind, no one noticed. The owner, a thin man with tired eyes, thanked him twice. Miller nodded once. There was nothing to explain. Back in his patrol car, he did not write the report immediately. He watched the store windows reflect the fading sky. The truck's return altered no statistics. It would not be counted as redemption. It was simply an action completed, like locking a door or turning off a light. He thought of Kane walking away from the bridge earlier that night. The boy had not promised anything. Perhaps that had been the only honest part. Miller understood that some decisions did not transform a life. They only redirect it slightly, like adjusting a wheel by a few degrees. As darkness settled again, he switched on his headlights and pulled back onto the road. The town absorbed the evening without resistance. Somewhere beyond the storefronts and empty lots, a 17-year-old moved through it unseen. Miller did not search for him. He drove his route, aware that continuation was the only certainty he had left. Night returned in its familiar layers. Streetlights cast thin halos onto sidewalks already drying from the day's last dampness. Miller drove past the sawmill once more. In the darkness, its rusted frame resembled scaffolding left behind after construction had been abandoned mid-thought. Nothing about it suggested revival. He parked at the edge of town and switched off the engine. Crickets filled the silence with a steady pulse. He remained inside the car, hands resting on the wheel, as if awaiting instruction that would not arrive. The badge on his chest felt lighter now, not because it weighed less, but because he expected less from it. He considered the boy's choice to return the truck. Not virtue, not repentance, simply a correction made before the road stretched too far. Miller understood that such corrections rarely appeared twice. A life offered brief openings, then resumed its slope. He had seen enough to know the pattern. In the distance, a single freight train passed, its cars clattering in measured succession. Each carried something away from town: grain, timber, metal, while leaving the emptiness intact. The sound lingered after the last car disappeared, vibrating faintly in the air. Miller stepped out and looked toward the dark horizon. There was no clear boundary between land and sky, only varying densities of shadow. He placed his hat back on his head and returned to the driver's seat. The night required nothing more than his presence. He turned the key and drove on, aware that some endings did not close. They simply fade into routine, where even the smallest decision becomes indistinguishable from weather. Morning approached again without ceremony. A pale stripe formed along the eastern fields, separating earth from sky by a narrow hesitation of light. Miller had not returned home. He had driven through the night, responding to minor calls, refueling at a station where the attendant did not look up from his newspaper. Fatigue settled into his shoulders like a familiar coat. He stopped once more at the Silver Smoke before the shift officially ended. The waitress unlocked the door as he approached, recognizing him without surprise. Inside, the air carried the stale trace of yesterday's coffee. He took the same booth, though no one had assigned it to him. The vinyl creaked softly beneath his weight. She poured without asking. Steam rose again, thin and temporary. He watched it dissolve into the fluorescent light. Across from him, the empty seat held its silence. The table bore faint scratches from years of cutlery and restless fingers. Marks remained long after the hands that made them had left town. He thought of Kane, somewhere beyond the main street, perhaps already awake, perhaps still asleep in borrowed space. The boy had chosen a narrow correction. Whether he would recognize it as such did not matter. Miller understood that guidance often appeared as absence, the absence of cuffs, the absence of a cell. When he finished the coffee, he left exact change on the table. Outside, the sky had lightened just enough to reveal color in the wet pavement. He adjusted his collar and walked toward the patrol car. The town resumed its slow breathing. Another shift waited. Nothing had been resolved, and yet something small had shifted. In places like this, that was the closest thing to motion. The day unfolded in measured intervals. A report about a missing bicycle. A call from a farmer who had mistaken a fallen fence for trespass. Miller drove from one edge of town to the other, the patrol car's tires memorizing the same curves. The sky held a dull brightness that offered no warmth. Near noon, he stopped at the hardware store for a replacement bulb for his porch light. The owner greeted him by name and asked nothing about the previous night. Transactions here were brief and sufficient. Miller paid in cash and placed the small box on the passenger seat beside his hat. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, he saw Kane across the street. The boy stood outside the laundromat, sleeves pushed up now, feeding coins into a machine. For a second, their eyes met. There was no signal exchanged, no gratitude, no warning, just acknowledgement that both remained present. Kane looked thinner in daylight, less like a figure dissolving into weather, and more like someone who still occupied space. Miller noticed the absence of the oversized truck. The boy carried nothing except a folded bundle of clothes beneath his arm. Miller did not cross the street. He entered his car and watched as the laundromat door closed behind the boy. The town continued around them, unremarkable and intact. He started the engine and drove on. Some gestures required no repetition. What had passed between them belonged to the night, and daylight did not need to revise it. By late afternoon, the air had cleared. The sky, though still pale, carried a faint depth that suggested distance beyond the fields. Miller parked near the river again, engine off, windows lowered. The water moved in slow continuity, neither rising nor retreating. He rested his forearms on the steering wheel and watched its surface shift without pattern. He considered the small sequence of events that now lay behind him. A confession spoken without drama, a tank refilled, a vehicle returned. None of it would be recorded as change. Yet something in him had adjusted an acceptance that authority could be withheld without collapsing the order of things. Across the river, a boy skipped a stone once and failed to make it travel far. The stone sank with a muted sound. The boy did not try again. Miller could not see his face clearly, but the posture seemed familiar, shoulders slightly forward, as if bracing against wind that was no longer present. He realized that what bound him to this town was not loyalty, but accumulation. Years layered over one another like sediment, forming a shape he could not easily step out of. Kane, by contrast, still moved within looser edges. Even fatigue at 17 left room for deviation. When he started the engine, the sun dipped low enough to cast longer shadows across the road. The river retained its steady motion. Miller drove back toward the main street, aware that continuation did not always mean repetition. Sometimes it meant allowing a small alteration to remain uncorrected. In a place where rust and rain defined the pace, that was a quiet form of defiance. Evening gathered with less resistance than before. The sky cleared enough to reveal a faint band of color along the horizon, diluted. Orange pressed thin against the fields. Miller drove his route slowly, not searching, only observing. Storefront lights switched on one by one, modest and functional. He passed the laundromat again. The windows were fogged from within. Through a narrow gap in condensation, he saw Kane seated on a plastic chair, folding clean shirts with deliberate care. The movement was unhurried, almost methodical. No one stood over him. No patrol lights reflected in the glass. Miller did not stop. Further down the road, the grocery store owner locked his door and turned the sign to closed. The same truck sat in its proper place near the loading dock. Nothing in the scene indicated interruption. Routine had resumed its quiet authority. Miller felt the weight of the day settle differently in his chest. Not lighter, not heavier, simply arranged. The absence of a report on his desk felt less like negligence and more like restraint. He had chosen not to convert the night into paperwork. Some events diminished when written down. He turned toward the river road as darkness returned. The fields lay open and unclaimed beneath the dimming sky. In the distance, a single porch light flickered on, steady and unremarkable. Miller drove past without slowing. The town held its shape. The boy folded his clothes. The river moved. Continuation, once again, required no announcement. Night settled cleanly, without rain this time. The air felt lighter, almost transparent. Miller drove the outer loop of town once more, headlights sweeping across fences, mailboxes, and patches of open field. The sawmill stood in silhouette, unchanged and patient in its decay. He parked near the bridge where the truck had stalled the night before. The river moved under a clearer sky now, reflecting a faint scatter of stars. He stepped out and leaned against the guardrail. The metal was cool beneath his paws. No vehicles passed. The road held its silence. He understood that nothing decisive had occurred. No redemption, no collapse. Only a narrow deviation in the expected pattern. Kane would continue making choices. Some would correct themselves. Others would not. Miller would continue responding to calls, filling forms, driving familiar routes. The structure of the town remained intact. A freight train crossed in the distance, its lights tracing a brief line against the dark. The sound carried, then thinned. Miller watched until it disappeared. Movement without destination had become the defining rhythm here. He no longer resisted it. After a while, he returned to the patrol car and started the engine. The dashboard lights glowed steadily. He adjusted his hat in the mirror and pulled back onto the road. The bridge receded behind him. Ahead, the town's scattered lights waited in quiet alignment. Another shift would begin, indistinguishable from the last, yet shaped by the smallest unrecorded mercy. Autumn arrived without announcement. The fields beyond town shifted from dull green to a restrained yellow, then toward brown. Leaves gathered along curbs and in the corners of parking lots, collecting where wind hesitated. Miller noticed the change only because the air had grown sharper in the mornings. He continued to see Kane from a distance. Outside the hardware store, loading small bags of cement into the back of a borrowed pickup. At the laundromat, later in the week, carrying folded clothes with both arms. The oversized sweatshirt had been replaced by a work jacket, still too large but less careless. They did not speak. Recognition had settled into something quieter than acknowledgement. At the station, Routine thickened with seasonal calls arguments about firewood boundaries, complaints about hunters crossing property lines. Miller handled each with the same measured voice. The report from that night remained filed under incomplete details, untouched and unchallenged. No one asked for clarification. Silence in official form proved durable. One evening he passed the bridge again and saw fresh tire tracks pressed into damp gravel near the guardrail. Not evidence of return, just evidence of passage. The river had narrowed slightly with the colder weather. Its surface reflected more sky than before. Miller slowed, but did not stop. He understood that what had occurred weeks earlier no longer belonged to decision. It had become part of the town's sediment, layered beneath newer incidents. Kane would either harden or adjust. Miller would continue measuring his days in small allowances. The season moved forward without commentary. Inertia did not end. It simply carried them into colder light. Winter edged in gradually, not with snow at first, but with a tightening of the air. Breath became visible in the early mornings. The river darkened, moving more slowly between banks rimmed with frost. Miller drove with the heater humming low, the windshield clearing in narrow arcs. He saw Kane one afternoon outside the hardware store again, stacking firewood into neat rows. The boy's movements had gained a certain steadiness. Not confidence, not ease, just repetition. A pickup idled nearby, not stolen this time. The owner, an older man with a gray cap, spoke to Kane without impatience. Miller watched from across the street and then drove on. At the station, holiday decorations appeared on the counterplastic garland draped without enthusiasm. Miller filled out routine paperwork, answered calls about slippery roads and minor collisions. Nothing demanded urgency. The town contracted inward as daylight shortened. One night, a light snowfall finally settled over rooftops and fields. It softened the outlines of buildings, covering rust and chipped paint with a temporary uniformity. Miller parked near the bridge again. The river carried small shards of ice along its surface. He stepped out and listened to the quiet that snow imposed. He understood that the night with the gas can had receded into memory. It no longer pressed against him. It had become one of many small divergences that shaped a life without announcing themselves. He returned to the car, brushing snow from his shoulders. The heater resumed its low hum. Ahead, the town's lights glowed faintly through falling flakes. Continuation persisted, even in winter. By midwinter, the town moved more slowly. Snow gathered in uneven drifts along sidewalks, pushed aside but never fully removed. The sawmill roof held a thin white layer that did nothing to conceal its sagging lines. Miller drove with measured caution, tires pressing deliberate tracks into the street. He saw Kane less frequently now. When he did, it was usually near the hardware store or walking along the river road with hands deep in his jacket pockets. The boy's face had thinned further, sharpened by cold and work. There was no visible transformation, no sudden redemption, only persistence. At the station, a notice arrived about budget reductions, fewer patrol hours, delayed repairs. Miller read it once and placed it in a drawer. The town had already been operating under quiet reduction for years. Official acknowledgement changed little. One evening, as dusk settled early, he noticed smoke rising from a small chimney near the edge of town, a trailer that had long stood dark. The plume was steady, contained. Later, passing by on his route, he saw Kane step outside to split wood beneath a weak porch light. The rhythm of the axe carried faintly through cold air. Miller did not stop. He reduced speed, then continued. The scene required no intervention. Snow began falling again, light and deliberate. The boy raised the axe once more. The town held its winter shape. Miller drove on, aware that some forms of survival were quiet enough to escape record. Spring arrived unevenly. Snow withdrew in gray patches, leaving behind mud and flattened grass. The river swelled briefly, carrying branches and last season's debris along its banks. Miller noticed the change in the way the air softened during his early patrols, though the town itself showed little reaction. He passed the trailer near the edge of town one morning and saw the porch repaired. A new board, lighter than the rest, had been nailed into place. The chimney no longer smoked. Instead, a window stood open, curtain moving slightly in the breeze. Kane stepped outside with a thermos in his hand and paused as the patrol car rolled by. Their eyes met briefly. Neither raised a hand. At the station, a young deputy from another county came through for training. His uniform fit tightly, his posture straight with expectation. He spoke of procedure with certainty. Miller listened without correcting him. The younger man believed in outcomes. Miller believed in endurance. The sawmill fence had begun to collapse along one side. Rusted wire sagged into the weeds. No one had filed a complaint. It leaned inward, as if surrendering to gravity. Miller drove past it slowly, noting the quiet inevitability. By evening, the sky held a clearer blue than it had in months. Miller parked near the bridge once more and stepped out. The river moved higher, louder than in winter. He stood with his hands resting on the guardrail and felt the slight vibration of water below. Nothing in the landscape declared resolution, yet something had shifted with the season, a subtle loosening. He returned to the car and continued his route, aware that continuation sometimes meant allowing the thaw to proceed without interference. Summer returned without ceremony. The fields beyond town regained their dull green, and heat settled into the asphalt by midday. Miller drove with the window open, dust trailing behind the patrol car on unpaved roads. The sawmill stood unchanged, its rust deepened by another cycle of weather. He saw Kane less often now. When he did, the boy no longer looked like a figure bracing against wind. He moved with the measured pace of someone who had accepted a direction, even if it was narrow. Once, Miller passed him driving a modest pickup with lumber tied carefully in the back. The vehicle slowed at an intersection, then continued without hesitation. At the station, the young deputy had begun speaking less and observing more. Miller noticed the adjustment without comment. Experience rarely arrived with noise. It settled gradually, altering posture and tone. One late evening, as heat thinned into a warm dusk, Miller parked at the bridge again. The river flowed lower now, steady and contained within its banks. Crickets replaced the hum of heaters and falling snow. He leaned against the guardrail, aware that a full year had circled quietly behind him. Nothing decisive marked the passage of time. No public acknowledgement of mercy. No report rewritten. The night with the gas can had dissolved into memory, then into sediment. Kane lived within the town's border still, not rescued, not lost, simply present. Miller returned to his car as stars began to appear over the fields. He started the engine and drove back toward town, understanding that the last vigil at the Silver Smoke had never been about saving anyone. It had been about remaining still long enough to let a small deviation endure. Steel and concrete dawn. Gray light slid under the overpass like a thin blade. It did not warm anything. Above, the trucks began before the sun did, their weight passing through concrete and bone alike. Kane woke not because he had rested, but because the vibration changed. The night engines were fewer. The morning ones carried urgency. Goods moved from one emptiness to another. He lay still for a moment, counting the seconds between axles. His bed was a folded tarp and two flattened cartons that once held televisions. The cardboard had softened from damp and time. He sat up slowly. His hands, thick and cracked, rested on his knees as if waiting for instructions. The air beneath the bridge smelled of rust, stale water, and something burned long ago. He did not think about the factory. He had learned that thinking changed nothing. Near the pillar stood the plastic canister. It was scratched white, with a cap that no longer sealed cleanly. He lifted it and felt its lightness. 2 miles to the gas station. Water cost more than it should. He walked along the edge of the service road, boots worn thin at the heel. Cars passed without slowing. No one looked at him long enough to remember his face. When he returned, the light had strengthened but not softened. The small lemon sapling waited in its dented paint bucket, soil dark and stubborn. A few leaves were powdered with soot. Kane crouched and wiped them with a rag he kept folded in his pocket, slowly, the way he once cleaned metal parts before inspection. The plant did not thank him. It simply remained. From the highway above came the steady thunder of commerce. Kane poured the water carefully, watching it disappear into the dirt. For a moment, the leaves trembled from the vibration overhead. He stayed there, hand on the rim of the bucket, as if guarding something larger than a sapling. The morning did not promise improvement. It only continued. The gas station stood beneath a flickering sign that promised fuel, ice, and something called convenience. Kane waited until the clerk finished arguing with a lottery screen before setting his canister on the counter. The plastic left a faint ring of dust. The clerk did not look at him. Water was measured, paid for, and dispensed without comment. It flowed clearer than anything else in the neighborhood. He carried it back along the shoulder of the road. The morning traffic had thickened. Tires hissed over damp patches left by street cleaners who never came under the bridge. Kane kept his eyes on the gravel. A man who walks with purpose is rarely questioned. A man who wanders invites attention. He adjusted his pace to resemble employment. Beneath the overpass, the air held the echo of engines like a memory that would not fade. The sapling stood where he had left it, leaves dull but upright. He set the canister down and unscrewed the cap. The smell of clean water was faint, almost imagined. He poured slowly, counting under his breath. Discipline was a habit he had carried out of the factory, like a tool no one asked him to return. The soil absorbed the water without gratitude. Mud formed briefly at the surface, then settled into itself. Kane touched one leaf between finger and thumb. It was thinner than it should have been. He did not frown. Plants weakened quietly, the way men did. Noise was from machines. Above him, a truck shifted gears. The concrete trembled. Kane replaced the cap and set the canister beside the pillar, aligned with care. He sat back on his heels and watched the small tree as if expecting instruction. Nothing changed. The ritual was complete. That was enough for the day. The bucket had once held white exterior paint. The label still clung to its side in torn fragments, promising durability against weather that no longer came. Kane had punched holes in the bottom with a rusted screwdriver. The metal had resisted at first, then yielded without dignity. Now the bucket served a quieter function. It contained soil carried in plastic bags from a construction site where no one guarded the dirt. The lemon sapling was thin, almost embarrassed by its own existence. Its stem leaned slightly, as if unsure of the direction of light. Soot from the highway drifted down and settled on the leaves in a fine gray film. Kane took out the rag again. He wiped each leaf slowly, supporting it with his palm, the way a soldier supports the barrel of a rifle while cleaning it. There was no haste in the movement, only repetition. The sound above did not stop. Engines layered over engines. The bridge translated their weight into a constant trembling. Kane worked through it without lifting his head. In the factory, he had once assembled parts for machines that now roared overhead. He had tightened bolts that carried strangers across distances they did not need to travel. The memory held no anger. It was simply information. One leaf showed a faint yellowing along the vein. Kane paused there longer. He traced the discoloration with his thumb, as if pressure might reverse it. He knew better. Metal fatigued. Paint peeled. Skin cracked. Living things followed their own decline. Still, he finished cleaning the rest before standing up. When he stepped back, the plant looked no stronger than before. It looked only attended to. Kane folded the rag and returned it to his pocket. Under the bridge, between concrete pillars and discarded bottles, a small patch of green remained visible. It did not improve the world. It required care. That was sufficient. The diner stood a block from the service road, its windows clouded by grease and time. A neon sign in the shape of a coffee cup flickered without conviction. Kane pushed the door open, and the bell above it rang, once, thin and tired. Inside, the air smelled of burnt oil and disinfectant. The floor tiles had been mopped, but never restored. He took the booth at the back, where the wall met a window that looked toward the highway ramp. The vinyl seat exhaled dust when he sat down. A waitress approached without hurry. Her name tag was turned backward. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him before he ordered. He nodded once. They did not exchange words. Words had become a luxury item. The coffee cooled while he watched the room. Two men in reflective vests ate eggs without speaking. A television mounted near the ceiling showed muted news footage of markets rising and falling. The captions moved faster than anyone could read. Kane rested his hands around the cup, but did not drink. Heat, like most things, faded quickly if not used. The waitress moved between tables with mechanical precision. Her steps were measured, her tray balanced against her hip. Kane observed the rhythm of her work, the way he once studied conveyor belts. Every gesture repeated, every motion necessary. No one here had a name that mattered. They were functions within a room that stayed open, because closing would require decision. Outside the window, trucks curved up the ramp and disappeared. Kane followed them with his eyes, until the glass blurred their outlines. When he finally stood, the coffee remained half full. He left cash beneath the saucer and walked back toward the bridge. The day had advanced without comment. That, too, was routine. When Kane returned to the overpass, the light had thinned into late afternoon. Shadows from the pillars stretched long across the broken concrete. He noticed her before she spoke. She stood a few steps away from the bucket, hands in the pockets of a motel sweatshirt that had been washed too many times. Her hair was pulled back without care. She was looking at the sapling as if it were a misplaced object. He did not ask what she wanted. She did not ask whose it was. The green between the trash bags and bent shopping cart seemed to interrupt whatever she had expected to find under the bridge. For a moment, neither of them moved. Above, a trailer roared past, shaking loose a small rain of grit. "You growing that?" she asked finally. Her voice was low, almost hoarse from smoke. Kane nodded once. He did not explain. The plant did not require explanation. It required water, time, and the absence of boots. She stepped closer, crouched without invitation, and touched one leaf with the back of her finger. Not to test it, only to confirm it was real. There was a faint smell of cheap tobacco in her clothes. She did not smile. He did not offer her a place to sit. The bridge provided enough shelter for two without negotiation. After a while, she leaned against the pillar opposite him. They faced the same direction, toward the service road where headlights were beginning to appear. No introduction followed. The small tree stood between them, silent and upright, as if it had been waiting for a witness. She returned the next evening without announcement. Kane heard her steps on the gravel before he looked up. She carried a crumpled pack of cigarettes in her sleeve. He reached into his jacket and produced his own. There was no greeting. Fire passed from his lighter to her cigarette, then to his. The flame flickered briefly against the concrete and died. They smoked facing the road. The smoke rose and mingled with the exhaust drifting down from the highway above. It was difficult to distinguish one from the other. Kane exhaled slowly, watching the gray dissolve into gray. Shared air required no explanation. It entered, it left. That was the agreement. The sapling trembled each time a truck crossed overhead. One leaf brushed against the rim of the bucket and held there. Sloane, he did not yet know her name, followed the movement with her eyes. She did not ask how long he had kept it alive. He did not ask where she slept. Questions demanded continuity. Neither of them promised that. Her cigarette burned unevenly. She tapped ash carefully onto the ground, away from the bucket. The gesture was small, almost formal. Kane noticed, but did not acknowledge it. Discipline recognized itself without comment. When the cigarettes were finished, they crushed the filters under their boots. The evening cooled quickly. She remained a few minutes longer, then pushed away from the pillar and walked toward the motel lights in the distance. Kane stayed where he was. The air still carried the trace of tobacco. It lingered, then thinned, like everything else. Sirens began before dusk had fully settled. They rose somewhere beyond the service road, cut across the industrial lots, and dissolved beneath the bridge in a hollow echo. Under the overpass, the sound did not alarm. It folded in on itself, contained. Kane had learned the difference between noise that threatened and noise that merely existed. This belonged to the second kind. Sloane stood beside the pillar, arms crossed against the cooling air. The sapling divided the narrow space between them. Above, traffic thickened into a continuous tremor. The bridge translated engines into a steady vibration that ran through concrete and bone alike. It felt almost protective, a ceiling of motion, a roof built from velocity. Neither of them commented on the sirens. Kane watched the road as headlights smeared across the underpass entrance. Sloane watched the plant. Her gaze lingered on the leaves, as if expecting them to respond to the city's urgency. They did not. The sapling remained upright, indifferent to alarms it did not understand. A freight truck downshifted overhead. The sound struck the underside of the bridge and multiplied, filling the space with a metallic roar. For a moment, conversation would have been impossible. Not that there was any. The noise sealed them into a private chamber, carved out of public chaos. When the sirens faded, the quiet felt denser than before. Kane adjusted the bucket a few centimeters away from the trickle of oily water creeping along the ground. Sloane shifted her weight, but did not step away. The city continued its unrest at a distance. Under the bridge, routine held. The yellow appeared without announcement. One morning, Kane noticed it along the edge of a leaf, a thin line like a bruise beneath the surface. He did not touch it at first. He only watched, crouched on his heels, while trucks passed overhead with the same indifferent rhythm as always. Change rarely arrived in spectacle. It preferred quiet corners. He wiped the leaf carefully with his rag, as if soot were to blame. The cloth came away gray, but the color remained. The yellow did not spread that day. It simply existed, a small fact attached to green. Kane measured the soil with his finger. Moisture clung beneath the surface. He had not neglected the ritual. Sloane arrived later than usual. She followed his gaze and saw what he saw. She did not kneel. "Looks tired," she said after a while. Her voice held no accusation, only recognition. Kane nodded. He had seen machines run beyond their tolerance, bearings thinning, belts loosening. Fatigue was rarely dramatic. It accumulated. He studied the leaf for longer than necessary, as if duration might influence outcome. The trucks continued to grind above them, carrying products wrapped in plastic certainty. By evening, the yellow had deepened slightly. Kane remained seated beside the bucket long after Sloane left. The leaf trembled from the vibration overhead, catching the dim light before settling again. It was not a crisis. It was a small adjustment in the balance of things. He accepted it without speech. She arrived with damp hair and the smell of motel soap that failed to erase tobacco. Kane noticed the sleeve first. It had slipped back as she crouched near the bucket. A pale line crossed her wrist, thin and deliberate. Not fresh, not entirely old. She followed his gaze for a fraction of a second, then pulled the fabric down with quiet precision. He looked away before she finished the motion. The service road offered safer details: cracked asphalt, a torn billboard flapping against its frame. Above them, a truck coughed through its gears. The bridge absorbed the sound and returned it softened. There were histories that did not require excavation. They existed like newspapers left in rain-ink bled, headlines unreadable, pages flattened into mud. She lit a cigarette and held it without drawing. Smoke drifted upward and tangled with the gray air. Kane did not offer his lighter this time. She had brought her own. The saplings stood between them, leaves dulled by exhaust and effort. Its thin stem held steady despite the tremor above. After a while, she extended her hand again, palm upward, as if measuring the vibration in her bones. The sleeve remained down. The gesture lasted only a moment before she lowered it to her knee. Kane kept his eyes on the road. Some wounds did not ask to be seen. They asked to be left in peace. When she stood to leave, the ground bore the faint imprint of her shoes beside the bucket. Kane remained seated. The trucks continued their passage overhead, carrying weight that did not belong to either of them. The air settled slowly once she disappeared toward the motel lights. The rain began without thunder. It slid down the sides of the overpass in thin, determined streams, tracing paths through soot and old graffiti. Kane stood beneath the edge of the bridge and watched how the water fell where it gathered, where it failed to reach. The sapling remained in its usual place, just beyond the cleanest runoff. Concrete decided what lived and what stayed dry. He stepped out into the open with the canister in his hand. Cold water struck his jacket and seeped through without resistance. Within minutes, he was soaked to the skin. He tilted the mouth of the canister upward, catching what the sky released freely. The drops struck the plastic with a hollow rhythm. It was inefficient. It was enough. Sloane appeared briefly at the mouth of the underpass, hair plastered to her forehead. She did not approach. She watched him standing in the rain, like a man performing a private ceremony. The traffic above slowed, but did not stop. Tires hissed against the wet highway, carrying impatience across the city. When the canister was half full, Kane returned beneath the bridge. Water streamed from his sleeves. He poured carefully into the bucket, letting the soil darken gradually. The sapling's leaves trembled, washed cleaner than they had been in weeks. For a moment, they seemed almost alive in a new way, glossed, alert. The rain continued, heavy and impersonal. Kane removed his jacket and laid it over the rim of the bucket to shield the soil from the direct downpour. His shirt clung to his back. He did not shiver. Above, engines moved through weather toward destinations that would not change. Beneath the bridge, the plant drank in silence. Cold settled after the rain with deliberate patience. The concrete exhaled dampness long after the sky had cleared. Kane remained beneath the bridge as darkness thickened around the pillars. The sapling stood in its bucket, leaves still faintly glossy from the storm. Moisture gathered along their edges and fell in small, measured drops. He draped his old jacket more securely around the bucket, tucking the sleeves beneath its base to block the draft that moved along the ground. The fabric was thin from years of use. It had once carried the smell of machine oil. Now it held only rain and dust. Kane pressed the cloth closer to the soil as if insulating a body against winter. Above, traffic thinned but did not cease. Each passing truck sent a muted tremor through the structure. At night, the vibration felt sharper, more intimate. It moved through his spine and into his jaw. He had grown accustomed to sleeping inside that rhythm. Silence, when it came, felt unnatural. Sloane did not appear. The space beside the opposite pillar remained empty. Kane sat on his folded cartons and watched the plant through the dim spill of highway light. The yellowed leaf showed more clearly in darkness, its color almost luminous against the gray surroundings. He did not reach for it. Observation was the only tool he trusted. Near midnight, the air turned colder still. Kane rubbed his hands together once, then let them rest on his knees. The jacket remained around the bucket. He did not reclaim it. He had endured colder nights in buildings without roofs and jobs without permanence. The plant required more protection than he did. That was simple arithmetic. From the edge of the service road, the factory was still visible, though it no longer produced anything. Its smokestacks cut into the horizon like blunt pencils worn to useless stubs. Windows along the main building were broken in uneven rows. Weeds pressed through the parking lot where shift changes once moved with mechanical order. Kane stood beside Sloane and followed her gaze toward the silent complex. The air carried a faint metallic smell when the wind shifted. He had entered those doors for 22 years. The floor had vibrated differently, then purposeful, contained. Noise had direction. It had led to wages and schedules and a clock that could be punched. Parts for cars, Sloane said, her voice almost swallowed by passing traffic. For the ones that run us over now, it was the longest sentence she had offered him. She did not smile when she finished. The words fell between them like small bolts dropped on concrete. Kane nodded once. He remembered the weight of steel in his hands, the repetition of torque and inspection. He had assembled pieces that traveled farther than he ever would. Now those same vehicles thundered above him, shaking loose fragments of dust from the bridge ceiling. Production had not stopped. It had only changed owners. They remained there until the light shifted toward evening. The factory's outline darkened against the sky, becoming less a building than a shadow. Kane did not feel anger. The place had consumed his hours and released him without ceremony. The sapling waited behind them under the overpass, requiring water rather than memory. That distinction mattered. They heard them before they saw them. Laughter that carried too easily. Metal striking metal in careless rhythm. A group of boys emerged from the far end of the underpass, hooded sweatshirts drawn tight, lengths of rebar resting against their shoulders like trophies. They moved without destination, testing echoes with each step. Kane remained crouched beside the bucket. He did not rise. Only his shoulders shifted slightly, aligning with the sapling as if adjusting his position in a machine. Sloane stepped back toward the pillar, her eyes narrowing but her body still. The boys noticed the green before they noticed the man. "Hey," one of them said, nudging another with the end of his bar. The word held no curiosity, only interruption. Kane's hands rested loosely on his knees. The skin along his knuckles tightened, pale against the grime. He did not speak. The silence between him and the boys stretched thin. Above, a truck thundered past, the vibration turning the moment into something suspended and unreal. One of the boys spat near the bucket, but did not step closer. They measured him quickly, the weight in his posture, the absence of fear displayed. Protection was not noise. It was readiness without spectacle. After a moment, their interest thinned. The rebar clanged once more against concrete, and they moved on toward the streetlight at the edge of the ramp. Kane exhaled only when their laughter dissolved into distance. He did not look at Sloane. He placed his palm lightly against the side of the bucket, feeling its cool surface. The sapling remained upright. That was sufficient. The cold arrived earlier than expected. It moved in quietly through the gaps beneath the bridge, settling into the soil before it reached the skin. Kane noticed it in the stiffness of his fingers. The sapling showed it differently. The yellowed leaf had not recovered. Another edge had begun to pale, faint but undeniable. He crouched beside the bucket and studied the stem. It felt thinner than it had weeks before. The soil, though damp, seemed tired compacted by repetition. Kane pressed his thumb against the surface and felt no resistance. He understood the arithmetic without sentiment. Winter would not negotiate. Sloane watched him from the pillar. She did not speak. The traffic above carried insulated drivers toward heated rooms. Beneath the concrete, the air held a metallic chill. Kane traced the length of the stem with his eyes, measuring its fragility the way he once measured tolerances on steel. He did not experience sorrow. Sorrow required expectation. This was simpler. The plant would not survive the season. The conclusion settled inside him like a small stone placed carefully in a pocket. Fact did not demand drama. It demanded adjustment. When he stood, his knees protested briefly, then steadied. He repositioned the bucket slightly closer to the driest part of the pillar. It would not change the outcome. It was merely maintenance. Above, another truck passed, shaking dust loose from the beams. The world continued without interest. Cain accepted the temperature as he accepted the forecast. She did not come that evening. Cain noticed it before he admitted it to himself. The space near the opposite pillar remained unoccupied, the concrete bare where her boots usually marked the dust. He told himself she might be late. The trucks continued their passage overhead, steady and indifferent. The sapling leaned slightly toward the road, as if listening. Cain adjusted the bucket a fraction, aligning it with the narrow band of light that slipped beneath the bridge. He kept his movements precise, unwilling to glance toward the entrance more than necessary. Waiting, when acknowledged, became heavier. Darkness thickened. The motel sign in the distance flickered red, then steadied. No figure emerged from its glow. Cain sat on his cartons and watched the place where she would have stood. The air carried no tobacco tonight, only the metallic scent of damp concrete and passing exhaust. Near the edge of the underpass, something small caught his eye. He rose and walked toward it without haste. A cigarette butt lay against the curb, the filter marked faintly with red. He recognized the shade. He did not pick it up. He studied it briefly, then returned to the bucket. When the night settled fully, the absence remained intact. Cain draped his hand over the rim of the bucket, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. The sapling did not shift. Above, traffic thinned but never stopped. The space beside him stayed empty. He did not search the road. He waited until waiting itself lost its shape. The garden supply store stood beside a warehouse converted into a discount furniture outlet. Its windows displayed bags of soil and plastic flowers that would never wilt. Cain entered with the same posture he used at the gas station, measured, unremarkable. The clerk glanced up briefly, then returned to his phone. He studied the shelves longer than necessary. Labels promised growth, resilience, yield. The words felt excessive. He chose the smallest packet of fertilizer, the cheapest one, and placed it on the counter. Coins left his palm reluctantly. The clerk slid the packet across without comment. Transaction completed. Expectation unspoken. Back under the bridge, Cain knelt beside the bucket. The air carried early winter in it now. He opened the packet carefully, avoiding waste. The granules were pale and odorless. He sprinkled them across the surface of the soil with deliberate precision, as if seasoning something fragile. The sapling did not respond. Its leaves remained dulled, one edge already curling inward. Cain pressed the fertilizer gently into the dirt with his fingers. He knew the calculation. Nutrients would not compensate for temperature, for light denied by concrete, for exhaust settling daily like ash. Still, action maintained order. When he finished, he folded the empty packet and placed it in his pocket rather than discard it. Sloane had not returned. The space beneath the bridge felt narrower without her presence. Cain sat back on his heels and regarded the plant as one might regard a task nearly complete. Doing something was not belief. It was structure. The afternoon carried a dry wind that scraped along the service road and funneled beneath the bridge. Cain heard the truck before he saw its shadow slide across the concrete. It was heavier than the rest engine strained, trailer loose against its coupling. The vibration struck the underside of the overpass with unusual force. Gravel lifted from the shoulder in a brief storm. Small stones rattled against the pillars and scattered across the ground. Cain remained crouched beside the bucket, eyes steady. One stone struck the rim and ricocheted. Another flew higher. The sound was slight. A clean, almost delicate snap. The main stem of the sapling bent sharply to one side. For a moment it held, fibers stretched beyond tolerance. Then it gave way. The upper half sagged against the rim of the bucket, leaves brushing the cold metal. The break was not violent. It was precise. Kane did not reach out immediately. He watched the angle of the stem, the exposed pale core where green had separated. Above, the truck continued down the highway, already distant. The tremor subsided into routine. The air settled. He extended his hand and touched the broken section lightly, not to repair it, but to confirm the fact. The plant leaned without resistance. He did not attempt to splint it. There are fractures that can be bound and fractures that announce conclusion. Kane remained kneeling until the light thinned, studying the quiet geometry of the damage. Night came early. The broken stem rested against the rim of the bucket, as if exhausted rather than severed. Kane stood for a long time without bending to it again. The air beneath the bridge had grown sharper, cleaner in its indifference. Traffic above maintained its schedule. He removed the jacket from around the bucket. The fabric was stiff with dried rain and dust. He shook it once and then stopped. Instead of putting it back on, he laid it carefully at the base of the pillar, half covering the bucket. The gesture held no ceremony. It was a practical decision without witness. The canister stood where he had left it, cap aligned. Kane picked it up and tested its weight. Light. He did not refill it. He looked once more at the plant, at the pale break in the stem, at the leaves that would not lift again. There was nothing to adjust. From the mouth of the underpass, the motel sign blinked red against the dark. No figure moved in that direction. The space beside the pillar remained empty. Kane stepped away from the bucket without haste and walked toward the service road. He did not turn back. Above him, trucks crossed the bridge in steady intervals, carrying sealed cargo through a country that did not pause. Beneath the concrete, the sapling remained in shadow, wrapped in a jacket that would not warm it. The arrangement was complete. Dawn returned without color. The sky above the highway was wide and vacant, a sheet of pale slate stretching beyond the industrial roofs. Kane walked along the shoulder of the road with the canister in his hand. It knocked lightly against his knee at each step. The rhythm replaced the tremor of the bridge. Behind him, the overpass receded into gray geometry. He did not measure the distance. The service road carried him toward the gas station lights, still burning from the night shift. Fluorescent tubes hummed inside the store, indifferent to morning. He adjusted his pace to match the movement of traffic, neither hurried nor slow. The air felt colder in open space. Without the ceiling of concrete, sound dispersed rather than concentrated. Engines passed and dissolved into distance without echo. Kane lifted his collar against the wind and kept walking. His boots found stable ground even where gravel shifted. Habit guided him more reliably than intention. He did not calculate a destination. The road offered continuity, and continuity was sufficient. The canister remained empty. He did not consider refilling it. There are rituals that end without announcement. The first full light of day settled over warehouses, billboards, and the long curve of asphalt leading out of the city. Kane walked toward it without expectation. The sky above America was large and unoccupied. He moved beneath it steadily, as if the act of walking were its own quiet form of order.